This night, we journey together to Aachen in the winter of 771, smoke rising from the palace workshops. It is the year 771 in a Frankish royal palace. The octagonal chapel has not yet been built. The construction lies more than 2 decades in the future, its pale stone still unquarried in the grey hills of the Eifel. Inside, a man of 23 winters moves between the scriptorium and the great hall, leaving traces of melted snow from his boots on the mosaic floor. He is Charles, king of the Franks and Lombards only in prospect, not yet crowned emperor, and not yet sole ruler of the kingdom he shares with his younger brother Charlemagne. Tonight, he listens to his scholars read aloud from Augustine, while outside the masons repair older walls by torchlight, preparing the palace for another season of winter residence. The palace at Aachen stands in the winter of 771, its stone walls weeping with condensation as the damp cold seeps through tapestries and settles into the rushes on the floor. You are standing in the great hall at first light, where the smell of beeswax candles burning low in the royal chapel at dawn still lingers in the passage beyond, thin and sweet, and already fading into the morning air. Around you, servants move quietly between the columns, their footsteps muffled by the frost that has gathered overnight on every surface, and through the high windows you can see the particular silence of snow falling on the palace roofs at Aachen, each flake descending without sound into the grey stillness of the Rhineland morning. This is the Francia that Charlemagne inherited, though the word inheritance does not capture the complexity of what passed to him and his younger brother Carloman when their father Pepin the Short died in September 768. The Frankish realm emerged from Roman Gaul and neighbouring Germanic settlement areas, a patchwork of territories that stretched from the Channel coast to the Alpine foothills, from the Atlantic to the Middle Rhine. You are walking now through the corridors of this inheritance, past the guards in their woolen cloaks, past the braziers that offer small circles of warmth against the penetrating chill, and you feel the weight of a kingdom that has only recently been made whole. Pepin the Short had seized the throne from the Merovingians in 751 with papal support, ending a dynasty whose kings had ruled in name since the 5th century, while powerful officials known as mayors of the palace increasingly exercised actual power. Pepin, son of Charles Martel, had made this arrangement formal, had himself anointed by the Pope, had established the precedent that his heirs would rule not merely in fact, but in name. Now those heirs, Charlemagne and Carloman, both crowned in separate ceremonies, the realm split between them, must find a way to govern what their father had held as one. You are standing at the edge of the courtyard at dawn, though there is no harbour here at Aachen, only the memory of Roman roads and the iron-shod wheels that still travel them. The crunch of frozen earth under horse hooves in December echoes from below, where messengers prepare to depart for the court of Carloman at Soissons, or wherever he has established his winter residence. For these anxious years of joint rule, messengers riding between courts have been the fragile threads binding 2 kingdoms that share a border running through the heart of the Frankish lands. Charlemagne's immediate inheritance included Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy, the eastern and northern heartlands of the Frankish world, while Carloman held territories to the south and east, including those regions of Aquitaine that their father Pepin had conquered and added to the kingdom. The kingdom faced threats from Aquitanian separatism upon Charlemagne's accession, for the southwest had never fully accepted the rule of the northern kings, and the division between brothers gave hope to those who wished to see the region free. Aquitaine had been conquered by Pepin and added to the kingdom, but conquest is not the same as assimilation, and the memory of independence smouldered in the valleys of the Garonne and the Dordogne. You are moving now through the antechamber, where petitioners wait in their heavy cloaks, their breath visible in the pale light, and you notice how the damp cold of the Frankish palaces seems to preserve everything in amber, as though time itself moves more slowly in these stone rooms. Charlemagne was born probably on the 2nd of April, 747 or 748, a date uncertain even to those who recorded his life. So distant did it seem from the world he would eventually command. He was the grandson of Charles Martel, the mayor of the palace who stopped the Umayyad advance at Tours in 732, turning back the Muslim armies that had swept through Iberia and into the Frankish heartland. This lineage mattered enormously to the Frankish aristocracy, who measured legitimacy not merely in blood, but in proven capacity for leadership and victory. You are standing beside the brazier now, feeling its warmth on your hands, watching the embers settle and glow. And around you the merchants are unloading their cargoes of grain and wine and iron from carts that have travelled the Roman roads still intact in places, their ruts frozen hard as stone. The royal household moved between palaces at Aachen, in Gelheim, Nijmegen, and elsewhere, following the ancient rhythm of itinerant kingship that prevented any single region from dominating the others or from growing too accustomed to the burdens of hosting a court. At each palace, the same routines unfolded: the morning prayers, the reception of embassies, the dispatch of orders to counts and bishops across the realm, the evening feast where the king's presence was itself a form of governance. You are tasting now the sour wine and barley bred at campaign rations, though there is no campaign yet, only the perpetual preparation for one, the mustering of supplies and men that occupies the winter months before the fighting season opens. Carloman's sudden death in December 771 prevented a permanent division of the realm, though no one could have known this as the year began. The two brothers reportedly met once, in 770, at a conference near the present-day city of Argentan, where they may have attempted to settle their differences and establish a framework for joint rule. The meeting had produced little beyond mutual suspicion and a marriage alliance that Charlemagne would soon discard. You are listening to the distant rumble of a cart approaching through the frozen morning, and you understand how slowly news travelled in this world, how a death in one palace might take days or weeks to reach another. The news of Carloman's death reached Charlemagne at the palace of Aachen in deep winter, carried by riders who had pushed their horses through snow and ice to bring word of the sudden opening of possibility. Carloman had been ill, perhaps, or perhaps his death was unexpected. The sources disagree, as they disagree on so much from this period. What is certain is that Charlemagne received the news in the great hall where you are standing now, surrounded by his advisors and the members of his household, and that he moved quickly to secure what chance had offered. You are feeling the cold air move across your face as a door opens somewhere, admitting a gust from the courtyard, and you watch the candles flicker and steady again in their sconces. Charlemagne secured his position against potential claims from Carloman's sons, who were young and whose mother, the widow Gerberga, sought protection from the Lombard king Desiderius in Italy. The Lombard kingdom in Italy, under King Desiderius, posed an early challenge that would shape the first years of Charlemagne's sole rule, for Desiderius had supported Carloman's widow and sons against Charlemagne, offering them refuge and the hope of a restoration. This alliance between the Lombard crown and the dispossessed branch of the Frankish royal family represented the kind of threat that could not be ignored, that demanded response not merely in diplomacy, but in force. You are moving through the passage now, past the chapel where the candles have burned lower still, their smell mixing with the cold stone and the faint sweetness of incense, and you understand that the peace of this winter morning is illusory, that war is already preparing in the minds of men who have not yet announced their intentions. The early years established patterns of military campaigning that would define the reign, the annual rhythm of assembly in spring, march to the frontier, summer fighting, autumn return, winter planning. This was not new to the Frankish world. Charles Martel had moved in similar patterns, and Pepin after him. But Charlemagne would extend these patterns across decades and frontiers, would make of the Frankish kingdom a machine for war and administration that had no recent parallel in the West. You are standing at the window now, watching the snow fall on the palace roofs at Aachen, each flake visible in the grey light before it settles and disappears into the white blanket that thickens on the tiles and the courtyard below. Charlemagne's first wife, Hildegard, of Swabian origin, married him in 771, perhaps before the news of Carloman's death, perhaps after. The chronology is uncertain. She was young, from a family that connected the king to the Alemannic nobility of the southeast, and she would bear him many children who would survive to shape the future of the realm. At each of the palaces where the court resided, Hildegard would have established her own presence, her own circle of attendants and chaplains, her own influence on the culture of the court. You are walking now through the women's quarters, where the damp cold is less severe, where tapestries hang thicker on the walls and the floors are covered with woven mats that soften the sound of footsteps. The taste of sour wine and barley bread reminds you that even kings must eat, must maintain their bodies through the privations that travel and war impose. Charlemagne was known for his physical stamina, his ability to endure the hardships of campaigning that broke lesser men, and this stamina was itself a form of charisma, a demonstration that he was fitted by nature for the role he claimed. You are sitting now on a bench in the passage, feeling the wood cold through your cloak, listening to the distant sounds of the palace, waking to another day of winter inactivity, the scrape of shovels clearing snow, the lowing of cattle in the byre, the occasional shout of a groom exercising horses in the courtyard. The Frankish realm under Charlemagne would become the most significant state in the West since the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, though this was not apparent in 771 or even in the years immediately following. The kingdom that Pepin had held, that the two brothers had divided, and that Charlemagne now reunited, was already large by contemporary standards, stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the Bavarian frontier. But its significance lay not merely in its extent. It lay in the institutions that the Carolingians had developed and that Charlemagne would expand, the alliance with the papacy, the reform of the church, the promotion of learning, and a standardized Latin that would shape European culture for centuries. You are rising now, moving back toward the great hall, and as you walk you notice how the smell of beeswax candles burning low has grown stronger, as though the chapel has prepared new lights for the morning office. The first Italian campaign began in the spring of 773, following Carloman's death, after Charlemagne had consolidated his hold on the Frankish lands and dealt with threats to his authority. The decision to cross the Alps was not inevitable. Diplomacy continued, offers were made and rejected, and the Lombard king Desiderius had supported Carloman's widow and sons against Charlemagne in ways that made accommodation difficult. But it was also true that the Lombard kingdom represented an opportunity, a wealthy and developed territory that could be added to the Frankish realm, and that Charlemagne was not a man to refuse opportunity when it presented itself in arms. You are standing in the courtyard now, where the snow has been cleared to make paths between the buildings, and you feel the crunch of frozen earth under horse hooves, though these horses are being prepared for a journey that will not begin for many weeks yet. The siege of Pavia, the Lombard capital, through a harsh winter, would be the longest and most demanding operation of these early years. Charlemagne led his army across the Alps in 2 columns, taking the Mont Cenis and the great St. Bernard passes, converging on the Lombard plain where Desiderius waited behind the walls of his capital. The city was well fortified, stocked for a long resistance, and the Lombard king had reason to believe that time was on his side, that the Franks would not maintain a siege through the winter months when supplies grew scarce and the weather turned cruel. You are moving through the stables now, where the warmth of the animals mingles with the smell of hay and leather and the sharp tang of urine, and you watch the grooms at work, their hands red with cold despite the relative shelter. The supply trains that accompanied the Frankish army as it moved south, the siege engines that would be needed against Pavian walls, all moved on Roman roads, still intact in places, their iron-shod wheels cutting ruts through the winter mud. Charlemagne had learned from his father and grandfather the logistics of war, the necessity of feeding men and animals across distances that consumed whatever was carried, the importance of securing lines of communication that could be maintained even when the enemy sought to interrupt them. You are standing at the gate now, looking out across the white landscape, the fields and the distant line of the forest barely distinguishable under their covering of snow, and you feel the particular silence of a world held in suspension, the snow having stopped now, the sky holding only the promise of more. The taking of the Iron Crown of Lombardy when it came was both a military and a ceremonial event, the seizure of a sacred object that conferred legitimacy on its wearer. The crown was said to contain a nail from the true cross, worked into the circlet of gold that the Lombard kings had worn for generations, and by taking this title, Charlemagne announced his claim not merely to conquest, but to lawful succession. By 774, Charlemagne had conquered the Lombard kingdom and taken the title King of the Lombards, adding this ancient realm to the Frankish lands he already held, extending his authority to the heart of the Italian peninsula. You are returning now to the Great Hall, where the fire has been built higher and the warmth reaches into the furthest corners, and you notice how the damp cold of the Frankish palaces begins to yield, if only in this one room, to the comfort that wealth and power can arrange. Though Aachen would become the favoured residence, the place where Charlemagne spent more of his time, and where he would eventually build the chapel that still stands, the rhythm of movement between palaces never entirely ceased. This was how the king maintained contact with his realm, how he reminded the great men of each region that their master was present and watching, how he prevented the accumulation of local power that might challenge his own. You are sitting now by the fire, feeling its warmth on your face and hands, watching the flames consume the beech logs that have been carried in from the forest, and around you the hall fills with the sounds of mourning, the servants spreading cloths on the tables, the dogs stirring from their corners, the first petitioners entering to wait their turn before the king. In 774, Charlemagne was in his mid-20s, already seasoned by years of joint rule and the sudden responsibility of sole kingship, already father to children who would inherit the world he was making. In his person, he embodied both inheritances that shaped the Frankish realm, the Roman through the church and the law, the Germanic through the language of his soldiers and the customs of his court. You are tasting again the sour wine and barley bread, though the bread here is finer, the wine less sour, for you are in the king's hall and not in the field, and the distinction matters, marks the difference between the hardship of war and the relative comfort of peace. The Merovingian dynasty had ruled in name since the 5th century before the Carolingian takeover, and their ghost still haunted the Frankish imagination. The long-haired kings who had been set aside, but not entirely forgotten, whose blood still ran in noble families who remembered their service. You are watching now as a priest enters the hall, his vestments bright against the grey morning, and you smell again the beeswax candles burning low in the royal chapel at dawn, though the office is long finished and the day has moved on to other ceremonies. The Carolingians had exercised actual power as mayors of the palace since the late 7th century, and this long apprenticeship in government meant that they took power with institutions already developed, with networks of loyalty and administration that could be expanded rather than created. To the core territories of Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy, where Carolingian influence was strongest, Charlemagne added Carloman's lands and then the Lombard kingdom, building a realm that surpassed anything his ancestors had held. You are standing now, moving toward the light of the high windows, and as you walk you feel the cold air move across your face, the perpetual draft of these stone buildings that no fire can entirely dispel. The concentration of power in one brother rather than two made the region more determined to preserve its distinct identity, not less. You are looking out now across the white landscape, the paths that lead away from the palace toward the distant roads, and you hear the crunch of frozen earth under horse hooves, the sound of riders departing with messages whose contents you can only guess. Desiderius had supported Carloman's widow and sons against Charlemagne, and this support had been his undoing, the provocation that justified the Frankish invasion and the destruction of his dynasty. In the chapel where you are walking now, past the low-burning candles and the silent figures of the saints painted on the walls, you can imagine the prayers that were offered for this success, the thanksgiving that rose to heaven from a grateful king. The annual departure for the frontier, the summer of fighting, the autumn return with plunder and prisoners, and the stories of what had been achieved, these patterns would be repeated and refined across decades. Hildegard would have known them from the beginning of her marriage, would have spent the campaigning seasons in one or another of the palaces, waiting for news that might come quickly or not at all. You are sitting now in the chapel, on a bench against the wall, and the particular silence of snow falling on the palace roofs at Aachen seems to penetrate even here, the muffled quality of a world held in suspension, waiting for spring and for war. The significance of the Frankish realm began in these early years, in the consolidation after Carloman's death, in the first Italian campaign, in the establishment of patterns that would be repeated and refined across decades. You are rising now, moving slowly, for the cold has stiffened your joints, and the warmth of the chapel makes movement seem unnecessary. And as you walk back toward the hall, you pass through the damp cold of the Frankish palaces, feeling the stone walls weeping with condensation, seeing the rushes dark with moisture underfoot. The taste of sour wine and barley bread seems distant now, a memory of summer and movement in this winter stillness. But it will return as the campaigns return, as the king leads his armies out again and again across the years of his long reign. You are standing at the window of the passage, looking out at the grey sky, the snow that has begun again to fall, each flake visible for a moment before it joins the white blanket below. The distant rumble of iron-shod wheels on Roman roads comes to you faintly from somewhere beyond the courtyard, a reminder that even in winter the world moves, that messengers and merchants and soldiers continue their journeys despite the cold. You will not remain here forever, will follow the king when he departs for other residences, other landscapes, other seasons. But for now the palace holds you, its damp stones and its low fires, its particular quality of silence that comes from thick walls and snow-covered roofs. You are walking now toward the sleeping quarters, past the guards who nod in their corners, past the doors that lead to rooms you will not enter, and the smell of beeswax candles burning low seems to follow you, or perhaps it is only that the smell has permeated everything, has become the scent of this place and this time. In the winter of 771, Charlemagne is young still, though the responsibilities he carries would age any man. He is the grandson of Charles Martel, the mayor of the palace who stopped the Umayyad advance at Tours in 732, and this lineage weighs upon him, demands that he equal or surpass what his ancestors achieved. You are lying down now, on a pallet in an alcove off the main hall, feeling the straw beneath you shift and settle, pulling the woolen blanket higher against the cold that seeps from the walls. The particular silence of snow falling on the palace roofs at Aachen surrounds you, and you close your eyes, and the day recedes, and the world becomes the sound of your own breathing and the distant movement of the palace around you. The damp cold eases as you drift, as the fire in the nearby brazier settles into embers that glow without flame. Somewhere a dog sighs in its sleep. Somewhere a door closes, softly, so as not to wake those who have already found their rest. You are warm now, or warm enough, and the stories of kingdoms and crowns, of brothers and their divisions, of campaigns across frozen passes, all of these fade into the darkness behind your eyes, into the slow rhythm of a winter night that will last until the pale return of morning. The cold air moves across your face one last time, and then does not move, and the palace holds its breath, and you are held, and the snow falls on, and on, and on. The sulphurous warmth of the hot springs steams in the cold morning air, rising from stone channels laid by Roman hands centuries before your own breath clouds before you. You are standing at the edge of the thermal waters, where Frankish servants draw heated buckets for the king's morning bath, and the mineral scent of the earth itself hangs over the valley like a veil that will not lift. Around you, the wooded hills of the Eifel rise in gentle folds, and the winter light falls pale across meadows where snow has drifted against the trunks of oak and beech. The cold air moves across your face, carrying with it the damp of the springs and the distant smoke of 100 hearth fires, for this place has begun to gather people as a wound gathers the body's own healing. Charlemagne made Aachen his principal residence, though older cities might have claimed precedence by tradition or size. Metz lay closer to the Rhine heartlands, and Paris possessed the weight of Roman memory. Yet the king turned his gaze toward these western hills where the waters ran warm even when the world lay frozen. The hot springs drew Roman settlement and made the site attractive to those who understood that comfort and ceremony could be joined in a single location. And so the messengers rode out through the winter of 793 to summon masons and carpenters, metal workers and glassmakers, to a valley that had known only modest habitation. You watch them arrive through the months that follow, ox carts laden with tools and tents, with sacks of lime and bundles of iron, with the accumulated knowledge of a dozen building traditions that will be bent toward a single unprecedented purpose. The ring of masons' chisels on imported marble becomes a sound heard for years, beginning with the first thaw and continuing until the frost makes stone too brittle to work. You hear it now as you walk the rising ground where the palace complex will stand, where surveyors have already marked their lines with stakes and cord. The smell of fresh mortar and sawn oak drifts from workshops established in temporary shelters at the valley's edge, and carpenters shape beams that will support the great weight of a dome no Frankish builder has yet attempted. The surrounding palace complex included audience halls, workshops, and living quarters, all to be arranged around the sacred core that will give the entire settlement its meaning. And already clerks scratch preliminary plans onto wax tablets that will be smoothed and revised 100 times before the first stone rises. On Palm Sunday, the 16th day of March in the year 794, you stand among the surveyors working on that morning, measuring the sunrise alignment that will fix the chapel's axis to the actual sunrise of Palm Sunday, 16 March 794. The dawn comes clear and cold, and the men hold bronze instruments steady against the eastern horizon, marking the precise angle at which the sun lifts above the distant hills. This orientation binds the building to a specific moment in sacred time, to the day of Christ's entry into Jerusalem, with a precision that speaks of learning brought from distant scriptoria, where astronomical tables are copied and studied. The foundation stone was laid around 795, though the ground must first be levelled, and the wooden foundations driven deep into the earth to bear what will come, and the sound of mallets on oak piles joins the other rhythms of the valley as the work begins in earnest. The play of winter light through the octagon's windows casts eight-sided shadows that you cannot yet imagine. For now, there is only the excavation and the rising of walls that seem to grow like something organic from the soil itself. The octagon was modelled on Byzantine and Ravenna precedents, and messengers have returned with measurements and descriptions, with reports of San Vitel's luminous interior and the great churches of the Eastern Empire, where domes float upon columns, as if gravity were merely a suggestion. The quarrying of stone occupies the summers, the transport of marble columns from Ravenna proceeding by river and road, by ox steam, and by human effort across hundreds of miles of Frankish territory, and you see one such column arrive in the autumn of 797, its fluted surface wrapped in straw against the hazards of the journey, the men who accompanied it gaunt with exhaustion and pride. The gradual emergence of the octagon from its wooden scaffolding across 8 years transforms the valley's skyline, season by season, as the walls rise and the arches are turned, as the drum takes shape that will carry the dome. The weight of bronze door handles, cold then warming to the touch, exists still as ore in distant foundries, though smiths already labour over the great sheets that will be hung upon iron frames. The building programme employed craftsmen from across the Frankish realm and beyond, Lombards who knew the working of stone, Frisians skilled in timber, Greeks who had seen the churches of Constantinople with their own eyes, and the languages of the worksite mix and overlap until commands pass through 3 translations before they reach the hands that execute them. The completion, approximately 803, seems impossibly distant in the early years, yet each autumn the walls stand higher than they did, and the king himself walks the site with architects whose names will not survive in any document. The echo of plainchant rising through the central dome, voices meeting at the apex, will require first that there be a dome at all, and the engineering of this curved space consumes the ingenuity of the builders across 4 full years. You watch them construct the wooden centering that will support the masonry until the keystone is set, and the structure finds its own equilibrium, and the smell of fresh mortar and sawn oak in the palace workshops intensifies as the moment approaches. The chapel's dome rises to approximately 31 meters, a height that will make this the tallest building north of the Alps, and the mathematics of its curve are tested in smaller models before the full execution is attempted. Extensive use of spolia from Roman buildings in northern Italy and elsewhere brings columns and capitals, carved blocks and bronze fittings into the new construction so that ancient imperial glory is literally embedded in the fabric of the renewed empire, and you run your fingers over the weathered surface of a capital that once stood in a Roman basilica, now reborn in this northern valley. The westwork incorporated a tower for liturgical processions, and you watch the framing of this western mass as the year 800 turns, the timbers raised by teams of carpenters who call to each other in dialects that share no common word for left or right, for up or down, yet manage nevertheless to fit each joint with hair's breadth precision. The throne of Charlemagne on the upper level faced the altar across the octagon, a position that will allow the king to participate in the liturgy as both ruler and worshipper, and the carpenters shape its wooden seat with the same care they would bring to a reliquary, for this is a throne that will hold more than a man's weight. The palace school and scriptorium operated within the palace complex, and already young men copy texts in preparation for the library that will serve this new center of learning, their quills scratching in rhythm with the chisels of the masons outside. Relics arrived in the 2 years before consecration, and their approach is announced by bell and by trumpet, by the dust of the road, and the gathering of crowds who have walked from distant villages to witness what they are told is holy. The arrival of relics from Jerusalem and Rome, processed through the streets, fills the narrow ways of the growing settlement with a solemnity that the king has orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. And you stand among the onlookers as the bearers pass, their burden wrapped in cloth of gold that catches the pale winter light. The church consecration, assumed for 17 July 802, though not securely attested, marks a moment when the building is deemed complete enough for sacred use, though finishing work will continue for months yet, and the first liturgies are sung in a space still smelling of plaster and new stone, the echo of plainchant rising through the central dome before the acoustic has been tempered by years of incense and candle smoke. The first Christmas liturgy in the unfinished building brings the king himself to stand before the altar he has caused to be made, and you are among the gathered court, the gathered clergy, the gathered workers who built what they now behold in use. Aachen became symbolic center of the renewed Western Empire in this moment, not by proclamation, but by the accumulated weight of intention and execution, by the gathering of relics and scholars and craftsmen, and the king's own presence through season after season. The ring of masons, chisels on imported marble continues, for buildings are never truly finished, and the completion, approximately 803, marks only a stage in a process that will continue through centuries of repair and embellishment. Legend of Consecration by Pope Leo III in 805 originates from 14th century, a fiction that will grow in the telling until it displaces the more prosaic truth of gradual completion, and the actual consecration assumed for 17 July 802, though not securely attested, fades from memory as the more dramatic story takes hold. You know what the documents say, what they do not say, and you let the knowledge rest in you like water finding its level. The chapel served as Charlemagne's mausoleum after his death in 814, and the king's private apartments overlooking the chapel through internal windows allowed him, in his final years, to gaze upon the altar where he had prayed, to hear the offices sung when he could no longer descend to join them. You stand in those upper rooms now, in imagination or in dream, and the cold air moves across your face from the window that opens upon the octagon's interior, not upon the outer world. The wooden seat remains, worn smooth by the touch of 30 kings who followed him, who came to be crowned in this chapel that he built. Aachen remained coronation site for Roman German kings until 1531, and the ritual of anointing and crowning repeated in this space across 7 centuries binds each successor to the first, to the king who chose this valley over grander cities, who oriented the chapel to the actual sunrise of Palm Sunday, 16 March 794. Among the first 8 UNESCO World Heritage Sites designated in 1978, the chapel stands now as it stood then, restored and preserved against the erasures of time, and you may visit it in waking hours to see what your dreaming mind has already constructed. The octagon was modeled on Byzantine and Ravenna precedents, yet became something neither of those sources could have predicted. A northern light filtered through southern forms, and the hot springs at Aachen drew Roman settlement and made the site attractive still to those who come seeking healing, seeking history, seeking the quiet that permits thought to unfold at its own pace. The smell of fresh mortar and sawn oak in the palace workshops has long since dissipated, yet in certain weathers, in certain lights, the building seems to release the memory of its own making, the accumulated labor of those 8 years concentrated in the particular resonance of a footfall, the particular quality of shadow in the octagon's angles. Charlemagne made Aachen his principal residence, and in doing so made this chapel the center of a world that extended from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, a world held together by the force of a single will and by the institutions, the buildings, the very stones that will expressed. The quarrying of stone, the transport of marble columns from Ravenna, all that labor of acquisition and movement has settled into the fabric of the building as a tree settles into its rings, invisible yet structural, and the extensive use of spolia from Roman buildings in northern Italy and elsewhere gives the interior its particular quality of temporal depth, of multiple pasts coexisting in a single present. You touch the cold surface of a column that stood in Ravenna when Theodoric ruled, that was quarried perhaps in Greece centuries before that, and the touch connects you to those moments as the building itself connects them. The king's private apartments overlooking the chapel through internal windows allowed a surveillance that was also devotion, the ruler's eye and the ruler's prayer directed toward the same focus, and you stand in that upper space now, feeling the particular quality of separation that looks upon sacred things from a height, from a remove that is also privilege. Aachen became symbolic center of the renewed Western Empire through these converging efforts, through the gathering of so many forms of making toward a single place and a single purpose, and the valley that had known only thermal modesty became, by this concentration, the axis around which a civilization turned. You are held now in the knowledge of what was built here, of the hands that raised it and the will that sustained it, of the king who chose this valley and the craftsmen who gave it form. The ring of masons' chisels on imported marble fades into the silence that follows all labor, into the silence that permits rest, that permits the slow repair of body and mind, which sleep accomplishes. The morning air in York carries the salt of the nearby coast and the damp of the river Foss, where you stand among the low stone buildings of the monastery. Alcuin of York, born in 735 near York in Northumbria, moves through the cloister with the unhurried pace of a man accustomed to long hours among books. Around you, the brothers prepare for the day's lessons, their sandals soft against the packed earth. The particular texture of calfskin stretched and scraped smooth awaits the next text to be copied, and the smell of oak gall ink, sharp and metallic, lingers faintly from the previous evening's work. You watch Alcuin pause at the scriptorium door, his hand resting on the frame as if he already knows what the messenger carries. The summons arrives on a morning when frost still clings to the thatch of the outbuildings. A rider from the Frankish court has crossed the narrow sea and ridden north through the kingdom of Mercia, bearing words for a man who will become the most important advisor to Charlemagne in educational matters, though Alcuin does not yet hold that title. The letter speaks of a king who wishes to gather the learned men of Europe, who wishes to restore the knowledge of antiquity to his realm. Alcuin reads the parchment twice by the light of a narrow window, the fading daylight at this northern latitude already requiring lamps by mid-afternoon. The warmth of the scriptorium, bodies close together in winter, seems suddenly insufficient to the task opening before him. You follow him as he makes his preparations through the turning weeks of early spring. The journey to Aachen will cover hundreds of miles through lands where the roads have deteriorated and where local kings still contest the authority of the Frankish crown. Around you, the monks pack volumes for travel, their hands wrapping each codex in oiled cloth against the rain. The scratch of reed pens on prepared vellum continues even as Alcuin prepares to depart, for the work of the monastery does not cease. The sound of pages being turned carefully, dry and rustling, accompanies the evening offices where prayers are offered for the traveller's safety. Alcuin has corresponded extensively with Charlemagne and other court figures even before this summons, his name passing between royal messengers for several years now. The road south takes you through landscapes of slow revelation. You are walking now through the rolling hills of Northumbria, where the sheep move like pale stones across the green. The cold air moves across your face with the persistence of a northern spring, neither warm nor fully winter, carrying the smell of turned earth and distant wood smoke. Alcuin rides a sturdy horse, his pack-horse laden with books he cannot leave behind. The particular texture of calfskin stretched and scraped smooth protects the volumes he has chosen, commentaries and grammars, and the poems of the Roman past. The smell of oak gall ink has permeated the leather wrappings, so that each package carries the scent of the scriptorium into the open air. Crossing the sea from the British shore to the Frankish coast, you feel the vessel lift and fall with the long swell of the channel. Irish scholars have also migrated to the Frankish realm, contributing to the cultural flowering that draws learning eastward across this same water. The warmth of the scriptorium seems a distant memory, now as spray breaks over the gunwale and the sail strains against its rigging. Alcuin stands at the rail, his face turned toward the horizon where the low coast of Francia gradually emerges from the haze. The fading daylight through narrow windows will soon be replaced by the wider light of a continental evening, by the different quality of air that moves across the flat fields of Flanders. The approach to Aachen reveals itself through days of gradual progress. You are riding now through forests where the beech trees stand in their early leaf, the ground beneath them pale with last year's fallen mast. The scratch of reed pens has given way to the sound of your own horse's hooves on the paved sections of the Roman road, to the creak of leather and the occasional call of birds in the canopy overhead. Alcuin, summoned to the Frankish court around 782, presses forward with the steady determination of a man who has committed his life to a purpose larger than any single monastery. Around you, the countryside opens into cleared land, into the patterns of cultivation that indicate the nearness of the royal estates. The palace at Aachen rises from the landscape with the confidence of new construction, though it incorporates the remains of older baths in its design. You are standing at the approach to the complex, watching the smoke rise from the various workshops and kitchens, hearing the multiple languages of the craftsmen and servants who have gathered from across the extended realm. The sound of pages being turned carefully will soon become familiar here, for Alcuin will lead the palace school at Aachen through decades of deliberate cultivation. The smell of oak gall ink will soon mingle with the sense of the royal kitchens and the stables. The first disputations in the palace school occur in a chamber where the walls retain the warmth of the hypocaust system beneath the floors. You are seated among the scholars who have gathered, Peter of Pisa and Paul the deacon, and Theodulf of Orleans among them, each man bringing his particular training to the common enterprise. Alcuin introduces the label Flaccus for himself, modeling on Roman poetic tradition, and you hear this name spoken as the discussion opens, as the first proposition is laid before the assembled company. The fading daylight through narrow windows has already necessitated the lighting of oil lamps, and the flames cast moving shadows against the plastered walls. The warmth of the scriptorium finds its counterpart in this heated room where minds converge upon ancient texts. The debate moves through the evening with the unhurried pace of men who understand that understanding itself requires patience. You are listening as Alcuin, now Flaccus in this company, speaks of the grammatical constructions of Priscian, of the proper distinctions between the cases in Latin declension. Around you, the other scholars contribute according to their expertise, each voice adding its particular weight to the deliberation. The scratch of reed pens has paused for this gathering, but the habits of the copyist inform the precision with which each speaker quotes his sources. The smell of oak gall ink seems to rise from the very clothing of these men, so thoroughly has their work permeated their presence. The sound of pages being turned carefully punctuates the discussion as texts are consulted and compared. The development of the new script begins in the month that follow these first gatherings. You are standing in the expanded scriptorium, where Alcuin has gathered the most skilled copyists from among the scholars and their students. Fingers black with ink testify to the hours of labor, to the careful formation of each letter according to the new standard. The development of Carolingian minuscule, a clear and uniform script, proceeds through hundreds of experimental pages, through the slow refinement of proportions and spacing. The particular texture of calfskin stretched and scraped smooth receives these trials, bears the evidence of false starts and gradual improvement. The fading daylight through narrow windows governs the working hours of the copyists, who must rest their eyes when the light becomes insufficient. The standardization of Latin pronunciation and spelling attempted in these chambers reaches beyond the palace to the bishoprics and monasteries of the extended realm. You are listening as Alcuin reads aloud from a corrected text, his voice producing sounds that differ subtly from the pronunciation of the Italian scholars, from the distinctive Latin of the Irish scholars who have also arrived. The warmth of the scriptorium creates an intimacy in which these variations can be noticed and discussed, in which the ideal of a unified practice can be pursued even as regional differences persist. The smell of oak gall ink accompanies each correction, each decision recorded in the margins of trial copies. The sound of pages being turned carefully marks the rhythm of collaborative deliberation. The copying of a Virgil manuscript occupies a special place in the work of this season. You are present when the rare text recovered from a distant monastery is unwrapped, its leaves damaged by damp and the depredations of time, but its contents largely intact. The court library assembles texts from across Europe through such recoveries, through the network of correspondence that Alcuin maintains with Charlemagne and other court figures. The scratch of reed pens resumes with particular care for this project, for the poems of Virgil hold a central place in the educational vision of the palace school. The fading daylight through narrow windows seems to pause as the first lines are transcribed, as the hexameters resume their measured course across the page. The Irish scholars arriving by sea bring their own contributions to this cultural moment. You are standing at the harbour when their boat grounds on the shingle, their Latin marked by distinctive pronunciation that will enrich and complicate the linguistic environment of the court. Martin of Leon, born in 819 in Ireland, will lead the cathedral school at Leon in a later generation, but the migration of his predecessors has already established the pattern by which Irish learning flows into the Frankish world. The cold air moves across your face with the freshness of the river mouth, carrying the smell of the sea and the tar of the boats caulking. The warmth of the scriptorium awaits these new arrivals, who will find in Aachen a different climate from their western island, a different quality of light and social arrangement. The smell of oak gall ink will soon become as familiar to them as the herbs of their native hills. The reform of monastic and cathedral schools mandated through Capitularies extends the influence of the palace to the furthest provinces of the realm. You are traveling with the messengers who carry these documents, riding through landscapes of forest and clearing where the royal authority manifests in the construction of churches and the establishment of new institutions. The copying of biblical texts, undertaken with new attention to accuracy, proceeds in these distant scriptoria according to the standards developed at Aachen. The scratch of reed pens accompanies this expansion, the sound multiplying across hundreds of workshops as the reform takes hold. The sound of pages being turned carefully becomes part of the acoustic environment of renewed monastic life. The distribution of corrected biblical texts to bishoprics across the realm proceeds through the established channels of royal administration. You are watching as the pack horses are loaded at the palace gates, as the sealed boxes are secured for transport to Trier and Mainz, to Tours and Lyon, and the southern cities, where Roman foundations persist beneath medieval accretion. The educational reform extends to clergy throughout the realm through these physical objects, through the material presence of corrected and authoritative texts. The fading daylight through narrow windows finds its counterpart in the torchlight of the courtyard, where the departure is prepared. The warmth of the scriptorium gives way to the broader cold of the open road, to the exposure of the messenger's journey. The poetic and historical composition flourishes at court in the intervals of administrative labor, in the evenings when the formal disputations have concluded. You are present at a reading where Alcuin, now fully established as the most important advisor to Charlemagne in educational matters, presents verses composed for a royal anniversary. The Carolingian Renaissance marks a cultural revival of Latin Christendom through such acts of creative recovery, through the deliberate cultivation of skills that are diminished in the generations of disruption. The smell of oak gall ink lingers on the pages from which he reads, for the poems exist first in manuscript before they achieve any wider circulation. The sound of pages being turned carefully marks the progression of the reading, the attentive silence of the assembled court. The years accumulate their gradual changes. You are observing Alcuin as he moves through the palace complex in the later 780, his hair whitening, his authority unquestioned, but his energy increasingly directed toward the preservation of what has been established rather than the creation of novelty. His departure for Tours in 796 to establish a regional center of copying is prepared through long negotiation with the king, through the recognition that the work requires distributed centers rather than a single concentration. The scratch of reed pens continues around him as these arrangements are made, the daily labor unaffected by the plans for transition. The journey to Tours repeats in reverse the long passage of 782. You are riding westward with Alcuin and his chosen companions, through the familiar landscapes of the Frankish heartland toward the Loire Valley and the monastery where he will spend his final years. The cold air moves across your face with the softness of a September morning, carrying the ripeness of harvest and the distant smoke of stubble burning. The warmth of the scriptorium will be constructed anew in this location, the social arrangements of the palace school translated to a monastic setting. The smell of oak gall ink will permeate the new workshops as it did the old. The sound of pages being turned carefully will accompany the continuation of the work. The scriptorium at Tours develops its own character under Alcuin's direction. You are standing in the enlarged workspace where the production of text has been organized according to the palace model, where the standards of the new script are enforced with rigorous consistency. Manuscript production increases dramatically, preserving classical texts through the multiplication of copies, through the systematic exploitation of the recovered originals. The fading daylight through narrow windows governs the working day of each participant in this enterprise. The scratch of reed pens marks the hours with its continuous presence. The gradual aging of the scholars becomes apparent in the turning of the years. You are observing Peter of Pisa as he moves more slowly through the palace chambers, his contributions to the disputations diminishing as his memory falters. Paul the deacon has already returned to Italy, his historical writings completed. Theodulf of Orleans continues his work in the south, his eyesight failing in the task of correcting text. The gradual aging of the scholars, their students taking up the work, represents the natural progression of intellectual generations, the transmission of skills through embodied practice rather than abstract instruction. The warmth of the scriptorium now includes these younger practitioners, their fingers black with ink as their teachers once were. The smell of oak gall ink marks their presence as it marked the presence of the first generation. Alcuin of York, born 735 near York in Northumbria, died 19 May 804 in Tours, surrounded by the community he had established. You are present in the monastery church as the offices are sung for his passage, as the light moves through the clerestory windows in the pattern of a May afternoon. The particular texture of calfskin stretched and scraped smooth lies beneath the hands of the copyists who continue their work even on this day, for the labor does not cease with the death of any individual. The sound of pages being turned carefully accompanies the prayers, the two forms of attention flowing together in the space of the monastery. The fading daylight through narrow windows gradually gives way to the lamplight of evening, to the continuation of vigil. The work persists beyond any single life. You are walking through the scriptorium in the years after Alcuin's death, observing the students who have become masters, who now instruct their own successors in the formation of letters and the correction of text. The educational reform extended to clergy throughout the realm has established a network of institutions where the practices developed at Aachen and Tours continue to propagate. The scratch of reed pens persists as the characteristic sound of this civilization, the auditory signature of its commitment to the preservation and transmission of knowledge. The smell of oak gall ink pervades the atmosphere of these spaces, becoming inseparable from the experience of learning itself. The manuscripts produced in these decades travel to libraries across Europe. You are watching as a cart is loaded with volumes for transport to a distant monastery, the fruits of the Carolingian scriptoria moving outward from their centers of production. The court library, assembled from across Europe, has been supplemented by the production of its own copyists, the balance of acquisition and creation gradually shifting. The warmth of the scriptorium finds its counterpart in the careful packing that protects against the greater cold of the open road. The fading daylight through narrow windows is replaced by the darkness of the transport cart, the manuscripts journeying through night as through day. The legacy of this moment extends beyond the specific productions to the habits of mind they cultivated. You are standing in a cathedral school of the later 9th century, observing the descendants of Alcuin's methods, the continuation of practices established in the palace at Aachen. The Carolingian Renaissance marked a cultural revival of Latin Christendom, not through a single achievement, but through the accumulation of small daily acts, the repeated labor of copyists and teachers across generations. The sound of pages being turned carefully persists as the audible evidence of this continuity. The smell of oak gall ink rises from the desks of students who will themselves become teachers. The scratch of reed pens continues its unhurried rhythm. The cold air moves across your face as you step from the scriptorium into the cloister, the transition from the warmth of concentrated labor to the broader atmosphere of the monastic enclosure. The particular texture of calfskin stretched and scraped smooth remains beneath your fingers from the page you have been examining, the tactile memory persisting beyond the visual. The fading daylight through narrow windows has indeed required lamps for some time now, and the monastery moves toward its evening observance. The warmth of the scriptorium disperses as the copyists depart for the refectory and then for the night offices, their labor suspended until the morning light permits its resumption. The stars emerge above the monastery buildings, their light unaffected by the lamps that burn in the scriptorium where a single copyist continues his work. You are standing in the courtyard, listening to the silence that has descended, the silence that follows all labor and permits the rest that sleep accomplishes. The sound of pages being turned carefully has ceased, and the smell of oak gall ink fades in the open air. The summer of 772 arrives with heat pressing down upon the forests between the North Sea and the Harz Mountains, and you are standing at the edge of a vast woodland where oak and ash have grown undisturbed for centuries. Around you, the Frankish host moves in ordered columns, their iron mail shirts heavy with sweat, their boots sinking into the leaf mold of ancient paths. The smell of crushed ferns rises from their passing, green and vegetal, mixing with the sharper scent of oiled leather and horses worked hard on the march. Through the canopy above, shafts of afternoon light fall in pale columns, illuminating motes of pollen and dust that drift in the still air. Somewhere ahead, beyond the screening trees, the sacred pillar of the Saxons stands in its clearing, a wooden shaft carved with the faces of gods who have watched over these people since before the Merovingians rose to power in Frankish lands. The Saxons have paid tribute to those earlier kings, but they have never been subjects, never bowed their necks to foreign lords, never abandoned the Germanic religious traditions that bind their loose tribal confederation in shared right and memory. You feel the weight of that independence in the silence of this forest, a silence deeper than any you have known, broken only by the distant sound of axe blows as Frankish pioneers clear the advance. The Irminsul waits in its grove, and the name echoes through the host as men whisper of its power, the great pillar that holds up the sky itself in Saxon belief. You are moving now through the final screen of brush, the thorns catching at your sleeve, the smell of wild garlic crushed underfoot rising sharp and pungent. The clearing opens before you, a space of beaten earth where generations have walked in procession, and there stands the Irminsul, vast as a ship's mast, carved with spirals that seem to move in the dappled light. Around you, the Frankish soldiers pause despite themselves, struck by the scale of what their king has ordered destroyed. The summer of 772 holds its breath in this moment, the last moment before the sacred becomes the profane, before the axe bites deep into wood that has never known iron. The sound comes then, rhythmic and heavy, and the chips fly pale against the dark trunk, and the smell of fresh-cut oak mingles with the smell of burning oak from the torches already being prepared. You watch the pillar sway, the sky seeming to shift with it, and then the crash as it falls, the sound rolling through the forest like thunder born of human will, the Irminsul, the Irminsul, the Irminsul lying shattered on the earth it once connected to heaven. The first winter in hostile territory settles upon the Frankish camps with a cold that seems to originate from the earth itself, seeping upward through the frozen ground. You are standing at the edge of a cleared woodland where axes have rung out for weeks, transforming sacred grove into timbered fortification, the stumps rising raw and pale from the snow. Around you, the encampment huddles against the wind that comes sweeping across the heathlands from the direction of the North Sea, carrying salt and the distant memory of open water. The taste of stale bread and watered wine on campaign has become familiar now, the wine sour with age and dilution, the bread hardened to the consistency of wood by the time it reaches the outer pickets. The iron cold of dawn breaking over frost-rimed encampments greets you each morning, the tents stiff with rime, the breath of men and horses rising in pale clouds that merge and dissipate in the grey light. The Saxons who submitted in summer have melted away with the first snows, their oaths dissolved by the knowledge that the Franks cannot remain forever, that the Irminsul will rise again in other groves if the invader can be outlasted. The deep silence of the German forests resumes each day as the Franks cut firewood and strengthen their positions, waiting for a spring that seems impossibly distant. Widukind moves through the marshlands like a spirit of resistance, his name passing from Saxon hearth to Saxon hearth, his presence felt more often than seen. You are standing at the edge of a bog where Frankish cavalry has foundered, the horses plunging to their bellies in the sucking mud of marshland where solid ground proves illusion. Around you, the survivors struggle to drag their mounts free, the mud making obscene sounds as it releases its grip, the smell of disturbed peat and decay rising thick and ancient. The keening of Saxon women after battle, carried on wet wind, reaches you from some hidden settlement beyond the marsh, a sound without words that speaks of losses the Annals Regni Francorum will record in terse phrases, the dry chronicle concealing human rupture. These narrative sources, the Annals and Einhard's Vita Carolingiani, tell you little of what Widukind whispers to his followers in the long nights, how he moves between the scattered tribes, how he maintains the loose tribal confederation against the pressure of Frankish arms. The smell of burning oak from destroyed Saxon shrines lingers in your clothing, in your memory, each destroyed sacred site becoming a recruiting ground for the resistance that will not name itself an army, but acts with greater effect than any host. The summer of 772 recedes, and the years of campaigning begin to blur annual movements into Saxon territory, becoming as regular as the agricultural cycle they interrupt. The year 778 brings rebellion under Widukind's leadership, the flame rekindled when Frankish attention turns towards Spain and the Pyrenees. You are standing in a frontier settlement where news arrives in fragments, carried by traders whose loyalties shift with the wind, their pack animals laden with salt and amber from the northern coast. Around you, the merchants unload their cargoes with the particular slowness of men who have learned to survive in contested country, their eyes never still, their ears catching every variation in the silence that presses upon these borderlands. The regular raiding into Frankish territory that preceded the wars resumes with renewed ferocity, the Saxon frontier proving impossible to seal, the Marcher territory still unestablished, still contested ground where neither king nor chieftain holds undisputed sway. Charlemagne's initial motives remain unclear, stopping raids or planned conquest and conversion, the question that occupied scholars in later centuries, already present in the confusion of the moment. You taste again the stale bread and watered wine on campaign, the provisioning of armies grown accustomed to living off a land that yields grudgingly, that hides its stores in forest caches and underground pits. The iron cold of dawn breaking over frost-rimed encampments finds you in different fields each season, the geography of resistance shifting, the names of places accumulating in memory without fixed association, Verdun still unknown, still future, still waiting in the unfolding of time. The massacre at Verdun comes in 782, the Lier River running with blood in a season when autumn rains have swollen the waters beyond their normal courses. You are standing on the bank where 500 Saxon prisoners kneel in ordered rows, their hands bound, their clothing dark with mud from the march that brought them here, their faces showing the particular blankness of men who have passed beyond hope, but not yet reached acceptance. Around you, the Frankish host stands in formation, the business of execution to be accomplished with military efficiency, the swords rising and falling in the grey morning, the sound unlike battle, more terrible for its regularity, its absence of resistance. The smell of iron and opened bodies mingles with the wet smell of the river, the Lier River receiving what falls, carrying it toward the sea that the Saxons know as their own, that boundary they have never considered a limit. You taste the stale bread and watered wine on campaign with a new awareness of what sustains conquest, the ordinary requirements of armies that must be met regardless of what the day contains. The archaeological evidence remains surprisingly scant for such a prolonged conflict, and no signs of depopulation appear in the Saxon lands. Yet here, in this moment, the absence seems impossible. The earth itself should bear some mark of what passes. The years of stalemate settle into routine annual campaigning, becoming as predictable as the turning of seasons. The Frankish host moving each spring into Saxon territory, withdrawing each autumn to more secure ground. You are standing in a camp that has occupied this clearing for 3 successive seasons, the trees beginning to return at the margins, the stumps sprouting pale shoots, the evidence of human presence sinking into the leaf litter that accumulates year upon year. Around you, the soldiers perform the tasks of occupation, repairing equipment, negotiating with local headmen whose authority the Franks have learned to recognize as more practical than their own appointed officials. The deep silence of the German forests, broken only by axe blows, has become companionable rather than threatening, the sound of wood being shaped for palisades or fuel, a constant undertone to days that pass in waiting. The smell of burning oak from destroyed Saxon shrines no longer rises as frequently, the supply of sacred sites diminishing, the religion of the conquerors establishing its own sacred geography in replacement. The forced Christianization includes mass baptisms and establishment of bishoprics, the waters of rivers receiving thousands of Saxon bodies in ritual immersion that changes nothing and everything, the outward form observed while the inward belief remains, perhaps, beyond reach. The Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae of 785, the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae will prescribe death for pagan practices, but that decree lies still in the future as these intermediate years accumulate their weight of half measures and partial submissions. Widukind finally submits and is baptized in 785. The enemy becomes subject in a ceremony that takes place at Attigny, far from the marshlands that sheltered his resistance. You are standing in the courtyard of the royal palace where Frankish magnates gather to witness what their king has accomplished. The autumn air mild with the particular softness of the Champagne country, so different from the harshness of the northern frontier. Around you, merchants unload cargoes of wine and fine cloth, the occasion demanding display, the submission of the Saxon leader requiring the theatre of Frankish power at its most elaborate. Widukind approaches in the white garment of the catechumen, his hair still braided in the Saxon fashion, his face showing the lines of years spent in evasion and resistance, the face of a man who has outlasted the first generation of Frankish commanders sent against him. The baptismal water touches him, and the name of the Frankish god is spoken over him, and the years of rebellion under Widukind that occurred in 778 and subsequently seemed to dissolve in this moment of formal reconciliation. Yet you notice how the new convert stands apart afterward, how the Frankish nobles maintain a distance that acknowledges the difference between submission and acceptance. The enemy becomes subject. The enemy becomes subject, but not yet the enemy become friend. The slow establishment of bishoprics at Bremen, Münster, Paderborn will follow, the organizational machinery of conversion, grinding forward with the patience of institutions that measure time in centuries rather than campaigns. The missionary Learger, appointed first bishop of Münster in 805, will find his work prepared by these decades of disruption and partial settlement. But in 785 the future remains unformed, the cathedral still unbuilt, the Christian community still scattered and dependent upon royal favor. You are standing in a frontier church, one of the earliest foundations, where a wooden structure serves for sanctuary, the smell of fresh timber not yet overcome by the accumulated incense of generations. Around you, the first converts gather for instruction, their Latin imperfect, their understanding of the new faith shaped by the Germanic religious traditions they have been compelled to abandon, the old gods lingering in their speech patterns, their gestures, their dreams. The Saxon frontier secured by establishment of marcher territories proceeds in parallel military colonization and religious foundation, advancing together, the one supporting the other in a pattern the Franks have learned from Roman example and their own expanding practice. The deportations mentioned in sources, not archaeologically verifiable, suggest a policy of displacement that may have existed more in threat than in execution, the labor of Saxon peasants too valuable to waste, the land requiring hands to work it regardless of whose authority claims the surplus. The years between Widukin's baptism and the final pacification unfold with the slowness of geological change, the conversion of a people measured in the lifespan of those born after the Irminsul fell, who knew the old ways only as whispered memory. You are standing in a marketplace that has grown up around a new bishopric, the slow establishment of bishoprics at Bremen, Münster, Paderborn, transforming the economic as well as the religious landscape. Around you, merchants unload their cargoes with an efficiency that speaks of routine, the dangers of the Saxon Wars, the Saxon Wars, the Saxon Wars receding into the background of commercial calculation, the risk premium diminishing year by year. The smell of burning oak from destroyed Saxon shrines has been replaced by the smell of beeswax candles in stone churches, the sensory markers of sacred space, entirely transformed, the old groves growing over, their locations forgotten by all but a few deliberate guardians of forbidden memory. The sucking mud of marshland where Frankish cavalry founded remains, the geography unchanged despite the political transformation, the natural world indifferent to the human claims laid upon it. The final submission of 804 comes roughly 3 decades after the first fires of 772, with the North Albingian Saxons among the last holdouts, accepting terms that their ancestors may have rejected. You are standing at a coastal assembly where the remaining Saxon leaders gather to make their formal submission, the North Sea visible beyond the dunes, grey and restless under an overcast sky. Around you, the Frankish officials arrange the proceedings with the precision of long practice, the rituals of surrender performed with the ease of repetition, the details varying only in the names of those who kneel and the particularities of the oaths they swear. The Saxon Wars lasted from 772 to 804 with interruptions, the first campaign aimed at Saxon people between the North Sea and Harz Mountains, and now that arc closes, the circle completing itself in the salt air of this northern shore. The final pacification allowed extension of Frankish administration and church organization, the machinery of empire grinding forward into the lands where the Irminsul once stood. You are standing in the same forest clearing where the sacred pillar fell, the oak and ash grown tall again in 3 decades of undisturbed growth, the site of the destruction now indistinguishable from the surrounding woodland, unless you know where to look, unless you have kept the memory precise across the years. Around you, a Christian chapel stands where the grove opened, small and unpretentious, its bell silent in the windless afternoon, the sound of its clapper waiting for the summons to prayer that will mark the hours in this reclaimed landscape. You move away from the chapel, from the clearing, from the weight of accumulated memory, and the forest receives you, the path narrowing, the canopy closing overhead, the particular quality of light that filters through leaves playing across your hands, your face, the ground before your feet. The smell of crushed ferns rises as you pass, green and vegetal, the same smell that greeted the Frankish host in the summer of 772, the same smell that will persist when all who remember that entry have passed to dust. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the moisture of the forest, the breath of growing things, the exhalation of soil that has witnessed generations of human striving and remains, itself, indifferent, patient, continuing. Around you, the deep silence of the German forests resumes its pattern, the sound distant now, intermittent, the forest healing around the wounds of conquest as it healed around the wounds of the Irminsul's fall. The smell of oak gall ink, sharp and metallic, fades in your memory, the dry rustling of pages turned carefully ceasing, and the cold air moves across your face one last time, and then does not move, and the forest holds its breath, and you are held, and the ink dries on and on and on. Christmas 800. The night the Empire was born, you are standing at the harbour at dawn, where the Tiber meets the wider world, and the mist rises from the water in thin spirits that dissolve before they reach the height of your shoulder. The cold air moves across your face with the particular dampness of Roman December, that chill which stone holds and returns, which churches drink from the night and exhale through the long hours of ceremony. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in silence, for the season has turned toward the feast, and even commerce must bow before the coming of the Christ Mass. The smell of wet rope and river silt mingles with something sharper, something that carries from the city above. Incense, heavy enough to taste, the resin of frankincense and the darker bite of myrrh, prepared in quantities sufficient for a pope who has known both danger and deliverance. The year is 799, though the distance between that year and the one that will change everything feels at once immeasurable and instantaneous. Pope Leo III, elected in December 795, reportedly fled Rome after being attacked by Roman nobles who allegedly struck him, attempted to blind him and cut out his tongue, accusing him of crimes that remain obscure in historical records. You're walking now through the Austrian gate, where the road begins its long reach toward the north, and the stones beneath your feet carry the weight of countless pilgrims, of armies, of desperate men seeking the protection of stronger men. Leo III fled to Charlemagne at Paderborn in 799, seeking protection from the Frankish king whose power had grown significantly through decades of military campaigns and diplomacy across Western Europe. The Saxon frontier became a Roman threshold in that summer of 799, when the Pope arrived as supplicant rather than sovereign. You are standing in the courtyard at Paderborn, where Charlemagne received the distressed pontiff, and the dust rises from the hooves of the horses that have carried Leo across the Alps, across the Rhine, across the territories that Charlemagne has made Frankish through conquest and conversion. The smell of horse sweat and leather mingles with the incense that Leo's attendants have brought, the same incense that will later hang heavy in the basilica where everything changes. The gold of the Mosaic apse catches no lamplight here, only the high summer sun. Yet the memory of gold travels with the papal party, the memory of St. Peter's and its treasures, of the city that waits to judge its bishop. Charlemagne travelled to Rome in late 800 to adjudicate the matter, but in the summer of 799 he listened, deliberated, and offered the protection that the sword of the Franks could guarantee. The particular quality of winter dawn through the basilica's clerestory is still far distant, still unimagined, as you walk with the slow progress of the royal train toward the Alpine passes. The cold air moves across your face with a different insistence now, the wind of elevation, of the heights where snow persists even in the month that lower valleys have surrendered to green. The murmur of two languages, Latin and Frankish, fills the spaces between the baggage trains, the clerics and the warriors, the scholars who have collected around Charlemagne's court and who will one day write this story with the precision of those who witnessed power in its moment of transformation. You are standing at the Brenner Pass, where the road narrows and the wind speaks of Italy beyond, and the stones beneath your feet are slick with the ice of early winter. The damp cold of Roman churches in December already anticipated in this higher, harder cold. The 3 days of ceremony and oath-taking before Christmas await at the journey's end, yet the journey itself is ceremony of a kind, the deliberate progress of a king who understands that arrival is only meaningful when preceded by expectation. The weight of the crown, reportedly of iron with gold studs, exists now only in the mind of the Pope who will place it, in the mind of the king who will receive it, though neither has spoken of this thing directly, if indeed they have spoken of it at all. Modern scholarship debates whether the event was planned or spontaneous, and you, walking through these passes, through these months, might sense the truth that inhabits both possibilities, that power prepares for what it cannot predict, that ceremony contains within its forms the capacity for surprise even to its principal actors. You are standing now in the atrium of St. Peter's Basilica, and the date is believed to be around Christmas Day, 800. The smell of incense heavy enough to taste fills your lungs with each breath, the preparation for the great feast already underway, the basilica dressed for the celebration of the Nativity, and for something else, something that has gathered in the air like the mist gathers above the Tiber at dawn. Leo swore a purgation oath clearing himself of charges on 23 December 800, a ritual of purification that Frankish custom demanded and that papal dignity required him to perform. You are close enough to see the Pope's face, the face that has known violence from his own people, that has known the humiliation of flight and the uncertain comfort of foreign protection. The gold of the Mosaic apse catches lamplight in St. Peter's, and the face of Christ looks down upon this transaction, this clearing of accounts that must precede the greater clearing that Christmas will bring. You are standing among the crowd that fills the nave, Frankish nobility and Roman clergy, the great men of two worlds brought together by the gravity of this king who has come to judge and who will instead be crowned. The cold air moves across your face with the specific chill of stone that has absorbed December's darkness and has not yet surrendered to the warmth of bodies pressed close, to the heat of lamps and torches and the breath of hundreds gathered in expectation. The murmur of two languages, Latin and Frankish, in the nave creates a texture of sound unlike any other, the sibilants of Rome mingling with the harder consonants of the north, and you understand that this sound itself is empire, is the acoustic reality of a world that has been joined by the will of one man and the desperation of another. The coronation took place during Christmas Mass at St. Peter's Basilica, the moment inserted into the liturgy with the seamlessness that only the most meticulous planning or the most inspired improvisation could achieve. You are kneeling now, as the king kneels, and the cold of the stone reaches through the fabric of your garments as it reaches through his, the damp cold of Roman churches in December that no number of bodies can fully dispel. Pope Leo III, who had been attacked by Roman nobles in 799 and fled to Charlemagne at Paderborn in that same year, raises his hands above the bowed head of the Frankish king, and the crown descends. The acclamation by the congregation rises like the incense rises, like the mist rises from the Tiber at dawn, a sound that fills the vaulted space and seems to seek the gold of the Mosaic apse that catches lamplight in St. Peter's. You are standing among those who shout, or you are standing among those who remain silent in wonder. The distinction matters less than the fact of presence, the fact of witness to this thing that has not happened in the West for centuries. Charlemagne crowned emperor 25 December 800 in Rome, the first Western European ruler to hold imperial title since antiquity, the restoration of a dignity that had slept in the East, that had traveled with the Byzantine emperors in their Greek-speaking city, while the West forgot the very grammar of empire. The title used was Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific emperor of the Romans, and the words fall upon the ears of the congregation with the weight of scripture, with the authority of liturgy, with the particular power of titles that name what they create. The smell of incense, heavy enough to taste, intensifies in the moment after the crowning, as if the smoke itself must mark this transformation, must write it in the air visible to those who will remember, and to those who will only know the story as it travels outward from this place. You are standing at the edge of the crowd, where the cold air moves across your face with the persistence of December's indifference to human ceremony, and you watch the new emperor rise from his knees. Charlemagne reportedly told Einhard he would not have entered the church had he known the Pope's intention, and this private reaction, this ambivalence of power, travels with you as you leave the basilica, as the cold air moves across your face with the freshness of outside after the density of within. The damp cold of Roman churches in December gives way to the broader cold of Roman streets, the stone absorbing heat from the pale sun, returning it slowly, insufficiently, to the shivering bodies that process through the Forum toward the Lateran Palace. The murmur of two languages, Latin and Frankish, continues in the open air, the negotiations of precedence and protocol that any great ceremony generates, the business of empire conducted in the aftermath of its birth. You are standing in the courtyard where messengers prepare for departure, the dispatch to Constantinople already underway, the long wait for response that will stretch across 12 years until Treaty of 812 eventually acknowledged the title. The Byzantine Empire refused recognition initially, as you might refuse to acknowledge a brother who claims the father's name, and the gold of the Mosaic apse catches lamplight in St. Peter's with a different meaning for those who know that another emperor lives, that another Rome persists in its Eastern form. The coronation created foundation for Western medieval imperial tradition, and you are standing at the origin of something that will persist until 1531, until Aachen remained coronation site for German kings, until that late date. The rituals of Charlemagne's Christmas copied and elaborated across 7 centuries of aspiration and decline. The smell of incense heavy enough to taste will hang in Aachen's chapel too, the memory of St. Peter's transported to the Rhineland, the gold of Mosaic apse catching lamplight in a smaller, more intimate space. Charlemagne counted as Charles I in both Holy Roman Empire and French royal succession, the number itself a claim of continuity, of legitimacy through enumeration, and you understand that this counting, this naming, is part of the work that ceremony performs, the transformation of moment into structure. The event transformed the theoretical basis of Charlemagne's rule, and you are walking now through the months that follow, through the years in which the title must be exercised, defended, explained to those who did not witness and to those who witnessed but did not comprehend. Charlemagne issued coins with imperial titulature, the small round statements of power that travel farther than messengers, that persist longer than memory, that bury themselves in earth and await the spade of future centuries. The coronation has been interpreted both as papal assertion of authority and as Frankish political necessity, and you, standing in the aftermath, might feel the truth of both interpretations pressing upon your understanding like the cold air moves across your face, like the damp cold of Roman churches in December presses upon the skin. You are standing at the harbour at dusk now, the reverse of the dawn with which you began, and the Tiber flows with the same indifference to empire that it flowed before. Pope Leo III survived until 816, dying 12 June in Rome, and his survival is itself a statement, a victory over the nobles who attacked him, over the dangers of papal office in a city that devoured its bishops. The cold air moves across your face with the evening's turn, the stone releasing what heat it held, the damp cold of Roman churches in December becoming the damp cold of Roman night in December. The smell of incense heavy enough to taste lingers in your garments, in your hair, in the memory of your lungs, and the murmur of two languages, Latin and Frankish, in the nave becomes the murmur of your own blood, the pulse of empire in the body that witnessed its birth. You are standing at the harbour at dusk, and the mist rises from the water in thin spirits that dissolve before they reach the height of your shoulder, and the cold air moves across your face one last time, and then does not move, and the Tiber holds its current, and you are held, and the empire continues, and on, and on, and on. You are standing at the edge of the Aachen assembly ground as the first frost of October settles across the grass, and the jingle of harness carries from the royal stables where grooms are leading out the horses that will carry the Missi Dominici through the winter circuits. Around you, the great men of the Frankish realm gather in their cloaks of wool and fur, their breath rising in pale columns that catch the weak morning light filtering through the chapel windows. The selection of Missi at the annual assembly follows a pattern established in the years before 8-2 and refined in the decades since. You watch as Charlemagne's officials move among the gathered nobility and bishops, pairing one secular noble with one ecclesiastic for each circuit through the provinces. The Archbishop of Mainz speaks quietly with a Lombard count who has served in the Spanish March, and their heads incline together over a vellum sheet listing the regions that require visitation. The pairing is deliberate, calculated to balance earthly authority with spiritual sanction, to ensure that neither sword nor crozier alone represents the king's voice in distant places. The Missi Dominici, these royal envoys sent in pairs to oversee local administration, must embody both the temporal and the sacred aspects of imperial power. A groom passes near where you stand, and the smell of leather saddlebags containing sealed parchment rises from the packhorse behind him, rich and pungent, the odor of tanned hide still carrying traces of the oak bark and alum of its curing. The saddlebags have been prepared through the night by chancery clerks, their fingers stiff with cold as they folded and sealed the letters of authority that will open fortified gates and command the attendance of local officials. You notice how the leather has been worked soft at the edges where rope will bind it to the pack frames, how the wax seals bear the impression of the royal signet that makes each document irreplaceable. The horses themselves stand with their heads lowered against the chill, their coats dark with the sheen of autumn health, and the jingle of harness sounds again as another pair is led forward for inspection. The mud of spring roads, axle-deep in places, lies months ahead in the calculations of those who plan these circuits, but already the clerks estimate which rivers will have rotted their bridges by the season of thaws, which mountain passes will remain blocked until May. The Missi were often drawn from the highest ranks of nobility and bishops, men whose names alone commanded respect in provinces they had never seen, and their selection at Aachen represents both honor and burden. You observe a Bavarian duke accepting his commission with a slight bow, his paired bishop already examining the sealed instructions that will govern their conduct. Their authority derived directly from the king, and this derivation was made visible in the ceremony of handing over, in the physical weight of parchment and wax transferred from royal hand to envoys' keeping. The assembly disperses toward the palace buildings as the short day advances, and you find yourself walking among the stalls where merchants display ironwork from the Meuse Valley and salt from the Atlantic coast. The cold air moves across your face, carrying now the smoke of cooking fires and the damp of autumn leaves trodden underfoot. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of provisions for the winter court, and their voices blend with the clatter of wooden crates and the lowing of cattle driven to slaughter. The winter light has given way to a grey diffusion of cloud, and the Aachen assembly ground empties of all but those preparing for departure. 2 days later, you are standing at a ford where the road crosses a tributary of the Rhine, and the water runs brown with the debris of early winter rains. The mud of spring roads finds its autumn echo here in the churned earth where previous travellers have struggled through the current, their wagon wheels cutting channels that now guide your own passage. The Missi Dominici whom you follow have paused on the near bank to assess the crossing, their paired figures outlined against the pale sky as they consult with the local guide who has materialized from a nearby settlement. The secular noble, a Frankish count with weathered hands and a beard streaked with grey, tests the depth with a mounted spear while his ecclesiastical partner, the Bishop of Strasbourg, reads from a portable breviary in the shelter of his cloak. The journey through the march proceeds at the pace that poor roads dictate, and the jingle of harness accompanies every mile as the party descends from the Rhine valley toward the more contested territories of the frontier. You are held in the rhythm of this travel, in the creak of leather and the occasional snort of horses, in the way the landscape unfolds in repetitions of forest and clearing that seem to deny the passage of time. The Missi travelled in circuits through the provinces, and this circuit has been designed to test the reach of royal administration against the friction of distance and terrain. The taste of dust on dry summer tracks through the bows, belongs to other seasons, other journeys. Now the air carries the mineral sharpness of cold water and the decay of vegetation suspended in winter dormancy. A village appears where the track widens, its church bell sounding the approach of strangers with 3 uncertain strokes that carry across the bare fields. The sound transforms the settlement before you reach it, drawing figures from doorways and sending children scurrying toward the priest's house with word of armed riders. The Missi Dominici have learned to read such reactions, to distinguish the fear of arbitrary power from the hope of royal justice. Their presence reminded local populations of royal authority in ways that distant capitularies and forgotten oaths could never achieve, and this reminder operated through the senses as much as through ceremony. You are standing in the nave of a village church where the hearing of complaints has begun, and the flicker of torchlight paints shifting geometries across the rough plaster walls. Around you, peasants wait in the rain that has begun against the thatch, their woolen cloaks steaming as they crowd through the doorway in approximate order of their grievances. The Bishop of Strasbourg sits at a portable writing desk, his ink prepared despite the poor light, while the Frankish count stands with his hand upon his sword in the gesture that signifies both protection and potential violence. The Missi investigated complaints against counts and other local officials, and this investigation required the patience to hear stories told in dialects barely intelligible to the polished ears of Aachen, the discernment to weigh testimony offered in ignorance of legal form. A woman approaches to describe the seizure of her family's meadow by a neighbouring lord's men, and her voice carries the particular cadence of grievance long rehearsed in solitude. The secular noble questions her with a gentleness that surprises you, his rough hands now folded in attention as she traces boundaries in the air with fingers twisted by labour. The ecclesiastic records her words in a script that flows across the vellum with the confidence of one who has written 1,000 such depositions. Charlemagne's administrative reforms depended on literacy among these officials, and you observe how this dependence manifests in the physical act of writing, in the bishop's steady hand, and the way he pauses to warm his fingers above the candle flame. The system attempted to create uniformity across diverse territories, and this attempt lived or died in the capacity of men like this bishop to translate oral testimony into the written record that would travel back to Aachen. The rain intensifies against the roof, and the torchlight grows more pronounced as drafts seek the flames. You move among the waiting peasants, catching fragments of other complaints. A miller claims excessive tolls. A widow describes the detention of her son by a count's bailiff. A priest protests the diversion of tithe grain to a local stronghold. The Missi investigated judicial delays and corruption, and this investigation extended through the long hours of winter afternoons when darkness came early and the church grew cold around its human congregation. The system revealed the limitations as well as reach of early medieval government, and you sense these limitations in the exhaustion of the petitioners, in the way their stories repeat with variations that suggest both widespread abuse and the difficulty of any centralized remedy. The following morning brings a confrontation that has been building through 3 days of hearings. You are standing in the courtyard of a count's residence, a wooden fortification raised upon an artificial mound where the local official has resisted the summons to appear before the Missi. The show of royal seals becomes necessary, the physical production of the sealed parchment from the leather saddlebags, the breaking of wax in the count's presence to demonstrate that these envoys carry unforged authority. The Frankish count, who serves as Missis, displays the document with the deliberation of a man who has performed this gesture before, and you observe how the local count's expression shifts from defiance to calculation as he recognizes the implications of resistance. The Missi Dominici derive their ultimate power not from their persons, but from the network of obligation and surveillance that these documents represented. The Bishop of Strasbourg speaks quietly of excommunication, and his voice carries in the still morning air with a resonance that seems to originate from beyond his slight frame. The system complemented rather than replaced local counts, and this complementarity now reveals its tense geometry. The local count must submit or face the combined sanctions of earthly and spiritual power. You notice how the retainers who have gathered at the palisade edge drift backward, unwilling to commit to resistance that their lord himself is abandoning. The smell of leather saddlebags containing sealed parchment seems to linger in this courtyard, a reminder of the bureaucratic infrastructure that supports even moments of dramatic confrontation. The local count kneels finally, and his oath of loyalty is required in the formula established by the Capitularies, witnessed by the assembled villagers who have followed the Missi from the church. The return journey to Aachen begins as the winter deepens, and the jingle of harness accompanies the party through landscapes now familiar in their repetition of hardship. You are held in the saddle or walking beside it where the track demands, and the empire continues in the person of these two men carrying their accumulated records toward the king. The mud of spring roads has frozen into ruts that threaten the horses' legs with every misstep, and the Missi have learned to travel in the hours of midday when the frost loosens its grip on the surface. They reported back to the king on conditions in the regions, and this reporting would shape the understanding of an empire that Charlemagne himself could never traverse in its entirety within a single reign. The oral report before the king takes place in a chamber warmed by hypocaustic heat that seems excessive after weeks of winter travel. You are standing among the clerks and officials who attend such audiences, and the amber glow of lamps reflects in polished wood and gilt. The Frankish count speaks first, his voice rough with the effort of translating experience into the forms acceptable at court, and the Bishop of Strasbourg supplements with the written record that has survived the journey in its leather protection. The reports inform the drafting of new capitularies, and you observe how Charlemagne listens with the stillness of a man accustomed to weighing testimony, his fingers interlaced upon the arms of his chair. The systematization of the Missi, Dominici from 802 onwards, becomes visible in the questions the king poses, in the way he compares this circuit's findings with those of previous years, searching for patterns of abuse or neglect that legislation might address. The Missi checked that royal decrees were being properly implemented, and their checking revealed the gap between legislative intention and local practice that yawned across the empire's vast extent. You notice how the king's scribes have prepared tablets for recording his responses, how the conversation between returned envoys and their sovereign generates the raw material of future governance. The institution persisted in modified form into later medieval periods, but here in this warm chamber you witness the moment of its effective creation, the improvisation of practice hardening into precedent. The drafting of new instructions based on what had been found occupies the remaining days of the assembly, and you find yourself in the scriptorium where clerks work by lamplight to transform oral report into written command. Around you, the scratching of quills accompanies the murmur of consultation as the Missi and the king's advisors refine the language that will govern next year's circuits. The smell of leather saddlebags containing sealed parchment mingles here with the fresher scent of new vellum and the iron gall tang of wet ink, a synesthesia of administrative creation. The next pair setting out as winter ended, the cycle renewed, appears before you as March advances, and the ice upon the Aachen roads begins to weep into the underlying gravel. You are standing at the same stable yard where autumn saw the departure of the Bishop of Strasbourg and his paired count, and the jingle of harness sounds again with the freshness of a new season. Their horses stamp in the thinning cold, and the grooms adjust packs that contain the new capitularies drafted in response to the previous circuit's findings. The mud of spring roads, axle-deep in places, awaits them, and the archbishop consults with his guide about which fords will be passable after the winter's accumulation of meltwater. You observe how the duke tests his mount's responsiveness, how his hand falls automatically to the sword that signifies his secular function within the paired mission. The Missi Dominici also examined the condition of churches and monasteries, and this examination would take the archbishop into sacred spaces where his episcopal eye could assess the state of religion that underpinned imperial claims. The party moves out through the Aachen gate, and you follow for a mile or two along the road that will carry them toward the Meuse and beyond. The sound of church bells marking the arrival of royal officials will precede them into villages that have never seen their faces, will prepare the ground for the hearings and the confrontations and the careful recording of testimony. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of spring goods, and the winter light has given way to a clearer promise that carries the eventual warmth of summer. The flicker of torchlight in village churches awaits them at journey's end, and the cycle of departure and return, of complaint and remedy, of finding and legislation, begins again in the person of these two riders diminishing along the muddy track. You are standing at the ford where you first observed the Missi crossing, and the water runs clearer now with the snowmelt of advancing spring. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the promise of change, and the empire continues in its attempt to make the distant present to the center, to render the local universal through the labor of men on horseback. The jingle of harness carries faintly from the road ahead, and then does not carry, and you are held, and the Missi Dominici continue, and on, and on, and on. The winter assemblies at Aachen draw the great men of the realm through frozen valleys and across rivers crusted with pale ice. You are standing in the outer courtyard as dawn arrives, the sky lifting from black to a colorless grey above the chapel and the royal halls. Around you, bishops wrapped in heavy cloaks move toward the warmth of the assembly chamber, their breath visible in short clouds that dissolve before them. Counts from distant marcher territories rub their hands together and stamp their feet against the paving stones, exchanging quiet greetings in dialects that share only their Latin when formal speech is required. The cold of the assembly hall awaits them, bodies packed close for warmth along benches and against walls where tapestries stir in draughts from ill-fitted doors. Charlemagne's legislative activity peaked in the 780, then 790, and this morning in the winter of 789 marks one of its highest moments. The scrape of knives preparing quills for writing carries from a chamber near the chapel, where clerks have worked since before light to ready the instruments of record. You move through passages where rushes whisper underfoot, past braziers that offer small circles of heat against the pervasive chill. The smell of ink, sharp and mineral, mingles with wood smoke and the damp wool of garments that have traveled far. Somewhere above, a door closes against the wind. The Capitularies were legislative and administrative decrees issued by Charlemagne, and today one of the most significant will receive its final form. The Admonitio Generalis of 789 is among the most famous Capitularies, and its clauses have been debated through long evenings by men who understand that the words chosen here will travel to every corner of the vast realm. The king sits among his advisers in the inner chamber, where tall windows of horn panes admit a milky luminescence. You observe from the periphery as parchment is smoothed across a table, its surface prepared with pumice and ruled with faint lines that guide the scribe's hand. The dictation of new decrees proceeds in measured phrases, each considered before utterance, for these words will carry authority across mountains and rivers to places their author will never see. Scribes taking copies for distribution sit at smaller tables along the walls, their quills moving in synchronized rhythm as they reproduce the essential clauses. The rustle of multiple copies being made simultaneously in the scriptorium creates a soft, continuous sound like dry leaves stirred by autumn wind. Latin was the language of all Capitularies, requiring clerical mediation at every stage of their creation and reception. The Admonitio Generalis addressed educational and ecclesiastical reform, and its provisions unfold across 70 chapters that touch upon the proper celebration of liturgy, the correction of texts, the establishment of schools, and the moral conduct of those who serve the church. You watch as a senior cleric reads back a passage concerning the education of the clergy, his voice level and unhurried, and the king nods, suggesting a minor alteration to the phrasing. Capitularies covered matters secular and religious without distinction of category, for the distinction itself meant less in a world where the king's authority derived from divine sanction, and where the church possessed lands and men subject to royal jurisdiction. The attempted standardization of law across diverse legal traditions of the empire proceeds clause by clause, addressing the Salian Franks and the Ripuarian Franks, the Lombards of Italy and the Visigothic remnants of the south, the newly subjected Saxons whose customs remained strange and resistant, the sealing and dispatch of instructions to Aquitaine, Italy, and Saxony occupies the days following the assembly's formal conclusion. You stand in the chamber where packets are prepared, the smell of sealing wax rising as sticks are melted over small flames and dripped onto folded parchment. The sharp scent, when broken, will announce to recipients that these documents have traveled intact, that no eye has read what was meant for other eyes. Messengers are selected for their reliability, their knowledge of roads, their capacity to endure the hardships of winter travel. Some will ride south toward the Garonne Valley, where Aquitaine maintains its particular character, its Romance speech, its memories of ducal autonomy. Others will cross the Alps through passes now treacherous with snow and ice, carrying packets for bishops and counts in the Lombard plain. The Capitularies represent an unprecedented attempt at legislative comprehensiveness, and the men who dispatch them understand, perhaps, the gap between comprehensive intention and actual reach. The dust of parchment being unrolled after months of storage drifts in a shaft of afternoon light as archivists retrieve earlier decrees for comparison and revision. You observe their careful movements, the way they weight the corners with polished stones, the way they read with lips slightly moving, translating written Latin into the spoken form that aids comprehension. The gradual accumulation of parchment rolls in palace archives testifies to years of legislative energy, to the accumulation of clauses upon clauses, corrections upon corrections. The revision of old decrees proceeds alongside the addition of new clauses, for the king and his advisers return repeatedly to subjects imperfectly addressed, regions incompletely reached, problems inadequately solved. Many survive only in later copies, textual transmission complex and sometimes uncertain, so that scholars in distant centuries will debate whether a particular clause originated with Charlemagne or with his successors who ruled in his name and manner. The Capitulaires de Villiers regulated estate management, and you find yourself in a chamber where this text is being prepared for dispatch to the stewards of royal domains. Its provisions specify the crops to be planted, the animals to be maintained, the renders to be delivered, the workshops to be kept in operation. Military obligations were specified in detail in companion documents that enumerate the equipment required of free men, the circumstances of summons, the penalties for failure. Standard weights and measures were attempted in clauses that recognize, implicitly, the chaos of local practice, the advantage of merchants who understand one system against those who understand another. Protection of the poor and weak was frequently proclaimed in language that echoes biblical precedent and Roman law alike, the widow and the orphan, the stranger and the unprotected. Whether such proclamations altered conditions in distant villages remains a matter that the documents themselves cannot answer. The local count reading aloud in the village square performs a ritual of authority that the Capitularies require but cannot guarantee. You are standing at the edge of the crowd, most listeners uncomprehending as the Latin syllables fall upon ears attuned to Germanic speech patterns, to the cadences of a vernacular that has never required written form. The sound of a count's voice reading Latin to a crowd of Germanic speakers carries across the open space where dogs wander and children fidget, and the business of the settlement continues around the margins of this formal occasion. The count's pronunciation reflects his training, perhaps imperfect, perhaps influenced by the sounds of his native tongue. What is understood partially, through translation offered by clerics who stand near him, through repetition of key phrases that acquire familiarity through sheer recurrence. Some addressed to specific regions, others to the whole realm, the Capitularies arrive with uniform text to be received into local conditions of profound variation. The Missi were instructed to check compliance with Capitularies, and you travel now in the company of such men, royal agents who move in pairs through the circuits of the empire. Their authority derives directly from the king, and their presence in a county interrupts the ordinary patterns of local power. You observe their methodical examination, their questioning of counts and bishops, their inspection of churches where decrees are meant to be posted and read. The Missi checking whether the new rules were posted in churches enter buildings, where the air hangs thick with incense and the faint sweetness of beeswax candles, where painted walls depict scenes of judgment and salvation in colors that have grown dim with years of smoke. They read the posted documents, compare them against their own copies, note discrepancies or absences. Their reports will travel back to Aachen, will accumulate in the palace, will inform the king's understanding of how far his words have penetrated. The recognition that some regions had barely changed despite repeated instructions arrives gradually, through the accumulation of such reports, through the king's own observations during military campaigns that reveal conditions far from the centers of power. You sense this recognition in the tone of later capitularies, in their renewed insistence upon provisions long proclaimed, in the addition of penalties for non-compliance that earlier versions perhaps assumed unnecessary. Enforcement was necessarily uneven across the vast realm, a truth that no amount of legislative comprehensiveness could overcome. Mountains, forests, marshes, and the sheer distance between Aachen and the outer edges of conquest created spaces where royal will attenuated, where local custom reasserted itself between visits of the Missi, where the count's court followed procedures that owed little to imperial instruction. The form influenced later medieval legislation, and the capitularies preserved in various manuscript collections, not systematically compiled, would be studied and imitated by rulers who sought to emulate Charlemagne's achievement. You imagine the hands that copied these documents in scriptoria of the 10th and 11th centuries, the careful reproduction of clauses whose original context had grown obscure, the gathering of related texts into collections that implied a systematic order never present in their creation. The textual tradition branches and converges, some manuscripts preserving versions found nowhere else, others offering conflated texts that combine provisions from different periods and purposes. Scholars in the modern age, and you among them in this imagining, trace these transmissions with methods the original scribes could not have conceived, establishing relationships of copying, identifying lost intermediaries, recovering something of the documentary chaos from which the surviving record emerged. The winter light fades early over Aachen as another assembly concludes, the bishops and counts dispersing to their accommodations or beginning their journeys home. You stand in the courtyard where torches are being lit against the gathering darkness, their flames making visible the breath of those who pass, the steam rising from horses recently ridden. The scrape of knives preparing quills for writing has ceased in the scriptorium, the day's work complete, the instruments laid aside for tomorrow's continuation. The smell of sealing wax lingers in the chamber where the last packets have been prepared, the sharp scent when broken awaiting its future release in distant places. You move through the settling palace, the dust of parchment still faint in your nostrils, the cold of the assembly hall yielding to the greater cold of evening. The stars emerge in a sky cleared by winter's dryness, and the capitularies continue their work in your presence, the cycle of assembly and dispatch and report and revision marking the rhythm of this government. You imagine the schools it mandated, the boys learning to form Latin letters, the gradual preparation of clergy who might themselves become scribes, might participate in future assemblies, might carry the king's words to further generations. Capitularies covered matters secular and religious, and this comprehensiveness reflects a conception of rulership in which no aspect of human affairs falls outside the ruler's concern, in which the salvation of subjects matters as much as their obedience, in which good order in this life prepares for judgment in the next. Preserved in various manuscript collections, not systematically compiled, the capitularies await their modern editors, their distant readers, their placement in narratives of state formation and legal history. You are among these readers now, held in the quiet of the palace as night completes its descent, the torches steady in windless cold, the sounds of the settlement beyond the walls diminished by distance and the thickness of stone. The Capitulaire de Villiers regulated estate management, and somewhere a steward consults his copy by lamplight, attempting to reconcile its instructions with the actual condition of fields and livestock, under his supervision. Military obligations were specified in detail, and young men in scattered settlements prepare equipment they hope never to use, train in formations they may never assume, await summons that may never come. Standard weights and measures were attempted, and merchants in marketplaces continue their negotiations, their calculations, their small deceptions that the law recognizes but cannot prevent. Protection of the poor and weak was frequently proclaimed, and the poor and weak continue in their condition, some aided by the law's declaration, others unaffected, others perhaps made more visible to exploitation by the very attention that proclaimed their vulnerability. Counts were required to hold regular public courts, and the courts meet, and judgments are rendered, and the record of their proceedings survives in fragments that suggest more than they reveal. Latin was the language of all capitularies, requiring clerical mediation, and the clerics mediate, translating, interpreting, sometimes perhaps altering in the act of transmission, their own understanding shaped by local conditions, by personal interest, by the limits of their learning. Many survive only in later copies, textual transmission complex, and this complexity is itself a record of the Capitularies' reception, their movement through time and space, their transformation by the very processes that preserve them. Enforcement was necessarily uneven across the vast realm, and this unevenness is not failure merely, but condition, the circumstance within which all government of such extent must operate, the gap between the word and the world that no administrative art can finally close. The form influenced later medieval legislation, and in this influence lies a kind of afterlife, the continuation of patterns established in these winter assemblies, these dictated clauses, these sealed and dispatched packets traveling into the cold. The Capitularies reveal both ambition and practical limits of Carolingian government, and you perceive both in the silence of the palace archive, where the accumulated rolls rest in their containers, in the darkness of the chapel where no light burns now, in the cold that penetrates despite walls and coverings, and the press of bodies seeking warmth. The winter assemblies at Aachen will continue beyond this night, will generate further decrees, further copies, further dispatches to Aquitaine, Italy, and Saxony. The dictation of new decrees will resume, scribes taking copies for distribution with the same careful movements, the same attention to accuracy that the medium demands. The sealing and dispatch of instructions will follow, the smell of sealing wax rising again, the sharp scent when broken awaiting other hands in other places. The local count reading aloud in the village square will perform his ritual again, most listeners uncomprehending as before, the Latin syllables falling upon ears that attend more to tone than to content, more to the fact of proclamation than to its specific provisions. The gradual accumulation of parchment rolls in palace archives will grow, will become in time the material from which later ages construct their understanding of this government, this ambition, these practical limits. The revision of old decrees, the addition of new clauses, will continue as long as the legislative energy persists, each revision acknowledging the imperfection of what came before, each new clause addressing conditions unforeseen, problems unsolved, regions unreached. You remain in the palace as the night reaches its deepest point, the cold most intense, the stars most bright in a sky that winter has cleared of cloud. The scrape of knives preparing quills for writing will begin again with dawn, the cycle renewed, the attempt continued, the words sent forth once more into the vast and various realm. The old king, a tablet under the pillow you are standing in the private chamber of the palace at Aachen in the winter of the year 813, and the darkness of January mornings in this northern place has settled so thoroughly that lamps must burn until midday to lift the shadows from the corners of the room. Around you, the medicinal herbs hang in bundles from the ceiling beams. their dried stems releasing faint traces of chamomile and vervain into the cold air that moves across your face. The particular darkness of January mornings in Aachen presses against the oiled linen stretched across the window openings, and you can feel the weight of the empire beyond these walls, stretching from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from the Atlantic to the Elbe, larger than any realm assembled since the distant fall of Rome. The aging king in his 60s sits before you at a small table of polished oak, and his fingers, still large and powerful despite his years, attempt to guide a bronze stylus across the surface of a wax tablet. You observe the resistance of wax to a stylus held in stiff fingers, the way the material clings and then yields, the grooves too shallow where pressure fails, too deep where frustration presses harder. Einhard, who knows this man better than most, will later record how Charlemagne attempted to learn writing in later life, how he kept wax tablets under his pillow for practice, how the shapes of letters remained elusive despite the effort of a mind that had mastered so much else. The tablet before him now bears the tentative scratches of someone who spoke Latin and understood Greek, according to Einhard, yet whose hand could not make the forms his tongue could shape so readily. You watch as he pauses, sets down the instrument, and rubs the slow ache from his thumb joints with the opposite palm. The warmth of thermal waters against aging joints has become, in these years, one of the few reliable comforts available to him, and you remember how fond of swimming in thermal baths at Aachen this king has been, how he would move through the steaming pools with a swimmer's ease that belied the stiffness of his mornings. The baths lie not far from this chamber, fed by the sulphurous springs that rise through the limestone beneath the city, and the memory of that warmth seems to hover in the medicinal herbs that fill this room with their concentrated scents. He is dressed simply in Frankish fashion, despite the imperial title he bears, a plain wool tunic without the jeweled encrustations that Eastern emperors might display, and his fair hair, described by Einhard as flowing in later life, lies thin across a scalp that carries the weight of 46 years of rule. His reign of 46 years was one of the longest of the medieval period, and the body before you carries the accumulated fatigue of campaigns and councils, of justice dispensed and borders defended, of the nightly attempt at writing that yields so little visible progress. The cold air moves across your face as a servant enters to replenish the lamps, and the particular darkness of January mornings in Aachen retreats momentarily before the fresh flames. The king does not look up from his tablet, though you sense he has registered the interruption in the way that rulers must, the perpetual alertness that sleep and age have not dimmed. His last years saw consolidation rather than expansion, the empire's boundaries now fixed in places that decades of warfare had established, the energies of the court turning inward to matters of administration and faith, to the correction of texts and the standardization of weights, to this persistent, private struggle with the shapes of letters. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in the harbor of memory, for the year 811 brought losses that no conquest could compensate. The deaths of his favored sons, Charles and Pepin, in 811, arrived as blows that even this robust frame could not absorb without visible wound. Charles the Younger died in that year, predeceasing his father, that prince who had ridden beside him in the Spanish campaign, and so many others, the heir apparent whose martial spirit had seemed the natural continuation of the father's own. Pepin the Hunchback, born around 770, died at Prüm in the same year, the son whose physical difference had never diminished the paternal affection, whose rebellion and subsequent imprisonment had been followed by this death that closed the possibility of reconciliation. You are standing at the harbor of grief as these cargoes are unloaded, the weight of them settling into the king's posture, the way his shoulders curve now, when he thinks himself unobserved. The silence of the chapel where the body lay in state seems to echo forward into this chamber, for you know that Prüm and the other houses of religion received these sons with the full honours of their rank, and that the father, despite the press of empire, found moments to mourn in ways that his position permitted. The succession was settled on Louis in 813, co-emperor crowned at Aachen, and this decision, born of necessity when so many alternatives had been removed by death, carried its own complex weight. Louis the Pious survived to inherit the empire, the youngest son who had been set apart for the cloister in childhood, whose piety had seemed to mark him as unsuited for the worldly demands of command, yet who now represented the only remaining thread of continuity. You observe the king's face as he sets down the stylus once more, the way his thoughts move across features that Einhard will describe with the precision of one who studied them closely in life. The warmth of thermal waters against aging joints calls to him even now, and you imagine him making his way through the connecting passages to those baths, the steam rising to meet his fair hair, the buoyancy of the water temporarily lifting the burdens that gravity and governance have accumulated. He is fond of swimming in thermal baths at Aachen in a way that transcends mere habit, the movement through heated water perhaps offering a freedom that the resistance of wax to a stylus held in stiff fingers has denied him on land. The medicinal herbs in the king's chamber will wait for his return, their preparations steeping in ceramic vessels, their purposes divided between the stimulation of failing energies and the sedation of pains that have become constant companions. The cold air moves across your face as dawn, such as it is in this season, begins to thin the particular darkness of January mornings in Aachen, though the lamps will continue their service for hours yet. The decision to crown Louis at Aachen in 813, ensuring continuity, had been enacted in the great chapel that the king himself had caused to be built, that octagonal wonder of stone and mosaic that rose as his own testament to the faith that underpinned his rule. You are standing in the private chamber, yet your thoughts move easily to that public space, the weight of the crown placed on Louis's head, the same that had come from Rome, the same that Pope Leo had set upon this father's brow in the snow of St. Peter's on Christmas Day of the year 800. The son had received it with the tears that were his characteristic response to solemn moments, and the father had observed with what mixture of hope and resignation only the wax tablets under his pillow might have recorded, had his fingers been equal to the task. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of memory, for the empire he built would be divided among his grandsons in 843, though no whisper of that future fragmentation disturbs the present concentration of this winter. His legacy shaped European political imagination for centuries, but the man before you knows only the immediate exigency of preparing a realm for transmission, of ensuring that the structures he has raised will survive the necessary passage from his hands to another's. Charlemagne had been called Pater Europae, Father of Europe, during his lifetime, and the title echoes in the documents that arrive daily from the scriptorium, in the embassies that seek audience, in the very air of this chamber where the attempt at writing continues its nightly renewal. The resistance of wax to a stylus held in stiff fingers resumes as the king retrieves his instrument, and you observe the particular angle of his wrist, the way he has adapted his grip to accommodate joints that no longer bend as once they did. Einhard will record how he kept wax tablets under his pillow for practice, this detail that speaks to a determination that outlasted the ease of accomplishment, that preferred the humility of continued attempt to the resignation of acknowledged limitation. You are standing in the private chamber at Aachen, and the particular darkness of January mornings has begun, almost imperceptibly, to yield to the grey of a winter noon that will bring no warmth, only a less absolute shade of cold. The medicinal herbs in the king's chamber release their compounded fragrances as a brazier nearby warms their hanging bundles, and the smell of thyme and rue mingles with the beeswax of the tablets and the tallow of the lamps. The aging king in his 60s, the empire larger than any since Rome, has survived the losses that might have broken a lesser spirit, has adapted to the diminishments that age imposes upon even the most vigorous constitution, has continued this practice of writing that yields so little visible fruit, yet persists as an act of will against the gathering dark. You feel the cold air move across your face as the chamber door opens and closes, admitting a secretary with documents requiring the royal seal, and the king sets aside his tablet with what appears to be relief disguised as responsibility. The warmth of thermal waters against aging joints will be his reward when the day's business permits, and you follow in thought as he moves through the necessary ceremonies of rule, the judgments delivered, the petitions received, the correspondence dictated to hands more fluent than his own. He spoke Latin and understood Greek, according to Einhard, and the secretaries who attend him write in both languages with the ease that their master has never achieved, the irony of command that permits others to execute what the commander cannot perform himself. The particular darkness of January mornings in Aachen yields to afternoon, and then returns with the early dusk of these northern latitudes, and you remain in the palace as the cycle turns toward evening once more. Buried in the Palatine Chapel, his tomb later opened by Otto III in 1000, the body would rest in the very structure that had defined his spiritual aspirations, the octagonal form that echoed the heavenly Jerusalem of patristic imagination. You are standing in the private chamber, and the lamps are being lit again, the particular darkness of January mornings in Aachen having completed its circuit back to itself. The king returns to his table, retrieves the tablet from beneath his pillow where it has waited through the day's distractions, and the resistance of wax to a stylus held in stiff fingers resumes its nightly rhythm. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of the past, for the last winter of 813 to 814 stretches before this scene with the inevitability of seasonal change. The thermal baths offering slight relief will continue their service through the months ahead, the sulphurous waters rising as they have for millennia, indifferent to the mortal frames that seek their comfort. You observe the king's face in the lamplight, the fair hair catching the glow, the features that Einhard described still bearing the impress of the vigor that had conquered kingdoms and instructed scholars. Dressed simply in Frankish fashion, despite imperial title, he embodies the paradox of power that his contemporaries recognized. The Pater Europae who chose to appear as one of his own armed peasants, the emperor who swam in public baths and ate roasted meat with his fingers, rather than maintaining the ceremonious distance of Byzantine courtliness. The cold air moves across your face as the winter deepens, and the medicinal herbs in the king's chamber grow more numerous, their preparations more complex, as the physicians attend to coughs that linger and a chest that seems never fully to clear. You are standing in the palace as the night reaches its deepest point, and the particular darkness of January mornings in Aachen has become the particular darkness of January midnights, the cold most intense, the stars most bright in a sky that winter has cleared of cloud. The warmth of thermal waters against aging joints calls in memory, even when the body cannot rise to seek them, and the king lies now upon his couch, the wax tablets under his pillow pressing their slight bulk against the mattress, the stylus laid aside, until morning brings its renewed attempt. The final illness in January arrives with the swiftness that pleurisy often brings to those whose chests have been weakened by previous winters and present griefs. You are standing in the chamber as the gathered bishops and nobles attend the failing figure, their murmured prayers rising with the smoke of incense that mingles with the medicinal herbs in the king's chamber, the compounded fragrances of mortality and hope. Charlemagne died on 28 January 814 in Aachen, and the particular darkness of that morning yielded for him to a light that none present could witness, the 46 years of reign completed in the same city where they had effectively begun. The empire he built would be divided among his grandsons in 843, but the body that had directed its construction lay now still, the large frame that Einhard described finally at rest from its labors. The burial in the chapel he had built proceeds with the haste that winter demands, the tomb sealed against the corruption that cold only delays. You are standing in the octagonal space as the body is lowered into the prepared place, seated according to the custom that Otto III would later observe, the crown and scepter placed in the stiffening hands, the imperial ornaments that had come from Rome returning with their bearer to the earth of the Rhineland. The cold air moves across your face as you remain in the chapel, and the particular darkness of January mornings in Aachen seems to have found its permanent habitation here, in this space where the greatest ruler of the age has been committed to the ground he had chosen. His legacy shaped European political imagination for centuries, yet the immediate fact is the weight of stone and the stillness of death, the cessation of the nightly attempt at writing, the stylus and tablets that will be discovered by those who inventory the chamber, their surfaces bearing the record of effort rather than accomplishment. He never fully mastered the skill despite effort, and in this failure, as in his successes, the human dimension of the great man persists for those who would understand him. The warmth of thermal waters against aging joints has departed with the life that sought them, the baths continuing their flow for other bodies, other centuries. You are standing in the chapel at Aachen as dawn, such as it comes in this season, begins to touch the golden mosaics with a light that cannot reach where the body lies. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of time, for the years will accumulate upon this tomb, the reign of Louis the Pious succeeding, and then fragmenting, the empire that had been so laboriously assembled dissolving into the kingdoms that would eventually become France and Germany, and the middle realm that would persist only in name and longing. Otto III, opening the tomb in 1000, found the body seated with crown and scepter, the imperial dignity preserved across 2 centuries of darkness and restoration. You are standing in that later moment now, the young emperor from Italy and Germany having traveled to this place in a gesture of symbolic recovery, the opening of the tomb an act of political theatre that nonetheless required the witness of the body itself. The cold air moves across your face as the tomb is resealed, the young emperor's devotions completed, the body returned to the silence that would persist until other hands, in other centuries, would seek it again. Canonized by Antipope Paschal III in 1165, not universally recognized, the sainthood of Charlemagne would remain contested, his memorial day on 28 January in Catholic and Protestant churches, marking the anniversary of death rather than the triumph of beatification. You remain in the chapel as the workmen complete their task, the particular darkness of January mornings in Aachen settling once more over the place where so much history has been concentrated, the resistance of wax to a stylus held in stiff fingers, now only a memory preserved in written record. The medicinal herbs in the king's chamber have long since dispersed, the room itself perhaps altered beyond recognition by the rebuilding of later ages. Yet the warmth of thermal waters against aging joints persists in the baths that still rise through the limestone beneath the city, and the memory of the tall man with fair hair who sought their comfort, persists in the accounts that Einhard composed with the fidelity of friendship and the precision of scholarship. His physical appearance described by Einhard, tall and robust with flowing fair hair in later life, becomes present to you across the distance of centuries, the body that swam and rode and campaigned and finally failed at the shapes of letters, still somehow accessible in the quiet of this chapel. The particular darkness of January mornings in Aachen has become a condition that you share with the long-dead king, the cold most intense, the stars most bright in a sky that winter has cleared of cloud. The weight of the crown placed on Louis's head, the same that had come from Rome, has been succeeded by the weight of crowns too numerous to count, the empires risen and fallen, the Europe that he fathered transformed beyond any recognition that he might have offered. His legacy shaped European political imagination for centuries, and in the shaping, the historical Charlemagne has been overlaid by the imagined Charlemagne, the figure of desire and projection, the pater Europe invoked by those who would unite what time has divided. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of sleep, for the narrative has reached its resting place, and the descriptive may now expand to fill the remaining distance. The warmth of thermal waters against aging joints persists in memory as a comfort sought and found. The sulphurous springs of Aachen continuing their ancient flow through darkness and through light, through empire and through its dissolution, through the centuries that separate your standing here from his standing there. The particular darkness of January mornings in Aachen yields now to a darkness more absolute and more gentle, the darkness of closed eyes and slowing breath, the darkness in which the distinctions of historical moment dissolve into the continuous present of rest. The medicinal herbs in the king's chamber release their final traces, the smell of thyme and vervain giving way to the neutral air of deep night, the scent of beeswax and tallow fading into the absence of scent that characterizes the approach of sleep. You are standing in the chapel, or you are lying down, or you are simply present in a space that has lost the specificity of architectural definition. The silence of the chapel, where the body lay in state, becoming the silence of consciousness, relinquishing its grip upon the particular. The cold air moves across your face, and then does not move, the temperature of skin and air achieving that equilibrium in which sensation ceases to register as external stimulus. The last winter of 813 to 814, the thermal baths offering slight relief, has become all winters and no winter, the season as concept rather than as immediate experience. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, or at dusk, or at that hour which belongs to neither, and to both, the merchants having completed their unloading, the cargoes distributed, the vessels rocking empty at their moorings. You feel the warmth of thermal waters against aging joints as the memory of warmth, the sensation without its physical cause, the body recalling what the mind has stored for moments such as this. Charlemagne died on 28 January 814 in Aachen, and in that dying entered a realm where dates and places persist only as the habits of the living, where the gathered bishops and nobles would long follow their king, where the final illness in January became one illness among countless illnesses that have marked the passage from vitality to stillness. The cold most intense, the stars most bright in a sky that winter has cleared of cloud. These persist as images without the coldness, without the brightness, the words having become sounds without meaning, meaning without sounds, the rhythm of syllables carrying the mind upon its gentle current toward the harbour of rest. The medicinal herbs in the king's chamber have dispersed into the general air, their purposes fulfilled or forgotten, the smell of them now only a word, a concept without sensory anchor, drifting across the threshold between waking and the state that follows. You are standing in the palace, or you are lying in whatever space has received you. The particular darkness of January mornings in Aachen having become simply darkness, simply January, simply the depth of winter when the year has not yet begun to turn toward light. The warmth of thermal waters against aging joints persists as the last warmth before sleep, the final conscious sensation before the body completes its daily surrender to restoration. You feel the cold air move across your face once more, or you feel the memory of that movement, the distinction between present and recalled sensation having dissolved as the mind settles into the rhythm of its own slowing. Yet in that resistance there is also testimony, the record of effort preserved across the centuries in the account that Einhard composed with such fidelity, the human detail that outlasts the empires and the crowns and the ceremonies of succession. The warmth of thermal waters against aging joints has become the warmth of blankets, the weight of covers, the simple comfort of horizontal rest after the vertical effort of waking hours. You are standing, or lying, or simply present in the space that consciousness occupies when it no longer insists upon the distinction between self and other, between observer and observed, between the living who remember and the dead who have become the material of memory. The cycle renewed, the attempt continued, the words sent forth once more into the vast and various realm. These persist as rhythm without content, as the sound of breathing that will accompany you through the remaining distance into the harbor of rest, where all cargoes are finally unloaded, where all merchants complete their journeys, where the resistance of wax to stylus becomes the yielding of consciousness to the depths that await it.